Hi guys. Tonight we step quietly into a cold world of long shadows and iron discipline. You're standing just outside the flicker of a medieval army's winter camp, where the air bites at your lungs and the stars burn sharp and white above you. Every sound is muffled by snow. Every breath hangs heavy in the still night. There are no glowing fireplaces here, no cheerful flames licking at logs. Only the faint shimmer of frost across the tent ropes, the dull glow of dying embers, and the slow rhythm of weary men settling into uneasy rest. You probably won't survive this night, at least not comfortably. The cold alone could crack you open, steal your breath, and turn your fingers brittle before dawn. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, and let's wander into the past together. You trudge between rows of sagging tents, the ground hard as iron beneath your boots. The smell hits you first, a mix of damp wool, smoke that never quite caught flame, and unwashed bodies pressed too close for too long. Men murmur in low tones, voices rasping with cold. Some pull cloaks tight around their shoulders. Others squat near piles of snow-blackened wood that never lit, their breath clouds, like ghosts. Medieval soldiers often camped far from villages or cities, relying on the land itself to sustain them. In winter, this meant almost nothing: no fuel, no forage, no warmth except what they could create with their own hands and bodies. Fires were risky. Too much light could betray a position. Too much smoke could reveal an army's strength. So, many nights, they simply didn't light them at all. You can imagine that moment when a commander gives the order, "No fires tonight." A collective groan, a tightening of cloaks, a grim understanding. You notice that even the horses stand close together, tails to the wind, sharing warmth the way men do. Their hides glisten with frost, breath billowing like tiny clouds. A few soldiers have dug shallow pits and huddled inside, wrapping themselves in their cloaks to trap body heat. Others simply lie down on the frozen ground, the earth as merciless as stone. The canvas tents, when they exist at all, are stiff and brittle, edges rimmed with ice. Some are patched with leather or animal hides. The sound of the fabric moving in the wind is faint and rhythmic, almost soothing, like waves brushing a distant shore. You slip inside one tent and find three men already asleep, curled like commas, cloaks drawn over their heads. The faint scent of tallow and sweat fills the air. One of them snores softly, and you think how deeply human that sound feels among so much hardship. A common fact among historians is that most medieval soldiers carried only what they could march with. Bedding was a luxury, not a right. A coarse wool cloak had to serve as both blanket and coat, and sometimes it doubled as a burial shroud. Yet here's a curious tidbit. In some regions, soldiers tucked heated stones wrapped in cloth inside their cloaks to stave off frostbite. The warmth faded quickly, but for those few blessed minutes, it was heaven. Historians still debate whether these men truly slept through the night or merely drifted in and out of shallow dreams. Some letters from the period describe half sleep, where soldiers closed their eyes but kept their ears open for movement, the crunch of a boot, the creak of leather, the distant horn of an enemy watch. Can you imagine that tension? To rest but not relax, to surrender to sleep while knowing death could arrive before morning? You crouch beside one man, his face barely visible in the dimness. His lips are blue at the edges, his hands clasped tightly over his chest. He mutters in his sleep something about home, a woman's name, maybe a prayer. His armor lies beside him, crusted with frost. You touch it lightly, and it burns your fingertips with cold. The silence around you grows heavier. Every so often, a gust of wind sighs through the camp, making the tents shudder. Somewhere, a horse stamps and snorts. The rest is stillness. You think about how the body adapts to this, how exhaustion dulls fear, how cold becomes simply another thing to endure. The men who fought in these wars were hardened not just by battle, but by nights like this, where survival itself was an act of will. There's beauty here too, though quiet and bleak. The moonlight glints on the metal rivets of helmets and buckles. The snow glows faintly blue. Even the frost on the tent edges looks like lace if you let your eyes soften. You realize that for these men, this was normal. No fires, no comfort, no warmth except the pulse of their own hearts. And still, they laughed, they cursed, they dreamed of home. You can almost feel the slow drift of fatigue pulling you down. The air is so cold that your breath feels thick, almost chewable. You tuck your cloak tighter, shift your body to avoid the worst of the wind seeping under the tent flap. The world outside seems to fade, only the small circle of your breath and the sound of your heart remain. Somewhere beyond this camp, another army does the same, their own soldiers curled in frozen sleep, their own commanders giving the same orders. Enemies who suffer together without ever seeing each other's faces. There's something quietly humbling about that symmetry. You think for a moment that maybe these soldiers didn't hate their foes as much as they hated the cold, that perhaps in some small, unspoken way, the shared misery made them kin. It's a comforting thought as you let your eyes close, feeling the weight of centuries settle around you like snow. Tomorrow will be another day of marching, another day of frostbitten fingers gripping spears, another night without fire. But for now, for this one fragile moment, there's stillness. A sleep that isn't peace, but something close enough to pretend. You wake before dawn, though wake feels generous. It is more like surfacing from a thin layer of half-dreams, your body stiff and unwilling. The cold has crept into your bones during the night, and every joint protests as you move. Around you, the camp still sleeps in its uneasy silence, a sprawl of men and fabric and frost. The air is thick with the smell of damp wool, leather, and something faintly metallic. Your breath fogs the dim space, and you can almost hear the soft hiss of ice melting from your eyelashes. You push aside the tent flap and step into the bitter world outside. The wind cuts instantly across your face, sharp as a knife. You taste it on your tongue, clean and cruel. The horizon is still dark, but faint ribbons of grey light stretch over the snow. You look out over the camp and see how the soldiers have arranged themselves in small groups, each trying to create a bubble of warmth. Most have little more than a tent of coarse canvas, sagging from last night's frost. Others have built makeshift lean-tos from spare shields and cloaks, wedged together with poles. Some have dug shallow pits, using the earth as insulation, curling up like animals in burrows. It looks desperate, yet strangely organized. You realize that every soldier knows this dance of cold survival, passed down through campaign after campaign. Tents were a sign of rank as much as comfort. The wealthy knights and captains could afford large pavilion tents lined with wool and canvas, sometimes even double-walled for extra insulation. The common soldiers, though, might share a single small shelter among 5 or 6 men, or sleep entirely in the open if supplies ran short. Still, even the poorest soldier had learned a few tricks. One common method was to dig a shallow hollow in the ground and lay down a layer of straw, rushes, or reeds. Over this, they spread their cloaks or blankets, creating just enough distance from the frozen soil to keep from losing every shred of body heat. A solid historical fact is that medieval soldiers reused almost everything, even the earth itself. If a day's march brought them to a new spot, they'd strip the old camp of straw, roll it up, and carry it along tied to their packs. It smelled foul and was often crawling with insects, but in winter, filth was less frightening than frostbite. Here's a quirkier tidbit. Some soldiers lined their tent floors with animal hides or discarded cloaks taken from fallen foes. The hides, if freshly tanned, still carried a faint warmth, and a layer of grease helped repel moisture from melting frost. Some men swore by this practice, while others complained it made the ground stink so badly it was impossible to sleep. Historians still argue whether soldiers' tents were truly waterproof. Some claim that well-maintained linen, coated in wax or oil, kept out most of the damp. Others insist the opposite, pointing to reports of men waking up soaked after storms or snowfall. Imagine lying there, half asleep, as cold droplets slide slowly from the roof and splatter onto your face. You can almost feel the shiver that follows. You kneel beside one tent, running your fingers along its seams. The fabric is coarse and rough, each stitch uneven but sturdy. Inside, the space is barely enough to sit upright. A pile of straw serves as bedding, flattened from the night's weight. You touch it and feel how it has absorbed moisture from the men's breath. There is no dry place here, only less wet ones. Some soldiers relied entirely on their cloaks. A cloak was more than clothing. It was identity, shield, and bedding all in one. A thick wool cloak, when doubled, could hold heat remarkably well, trapping the faint warmth of a human body. You watch as a young archer pulls his cloak around him like a cocoon, his boots tucked under the hem to keep out the chill. His bow lies beside him, strung and ready, because in this world, even sleep requires vigilance. The sound of fabric shifting in the wind creates a strange kind of rhythm. Each tent sways gently, the ropes creaking, the poles groaning like tired bones. It almost feels alive, breathing with the men inside. You can smell the faint sweetness of straw, mixed with the musk of sweat and iron. The camp is a body, and each tent is a heartbeat. You try to imagine what warmth meant here. It was not comfort, not the kind you know now with heated blankets and fireplaces. Warmth was survival. A layer of straw meant a few more hours of rest. A dry cloak meant fewer sores on your skin. A patch of ground sheltered from the wind meant the difference between shivering through the night and dying quietly before dawn. There is a quiet pride in this kind of endurance. The men knew that no battle tested them as fiercely as winter itself. The chronicles often praise victories and conquests, but rarely do they mention the quiet triumph of simply waking up alive after a night like this. Yet without that small victory, none of the others could exist. You look up at the sky again, where the first weak light of morning begins to pierce through. The tents glow faintly, translucent with frost. The air hums with the slow stir of waking men. Somewhere, a commander's horn sounds a long, mournful note that seems to hang forever before fading. The soldiers groan, stretch, and begin to move. Cloaks are shaken out, armor plates clatter, and voices rise like smoke. You realize that each night in a camp like this must have been a negotiation. The men traded comfort for safety, warmth for stealth, sleep for readiness. They built their world out of cloth, earth, and willpower. Every tent, no matter how small or poor, was a declaration that they would survive at least one more night. You feel the weight of that determination in your chest, as though it has traveled through the centuries to sit beside you now. You pull your cloak tighter, as if joining them in silent solidarity. The wind softens for a moment, almost kindly, and you let your eyes close again, not in sleep, but in quiet respect for those who once endured what you can only imagine. The sun creeps slowly over the rim of the horizon, a pale and watery light that barely touches the frost before vanishing again. You pull your cloak tighter, feeling the stiffness of frozen fabric against your neck. Around you, soldiers are shaking out their blankets, brushing frost from their gear, and stamping their feet to coax warmth back into numb toes. It is morning, but the cold still clings to everything like a stubborn ghost. The fabric they wear matters more than anything else now. Wool, linen, leather. Each layer stands between life and the biting air. You can almost feel the scratch of coarse wool against your own skin, its fibers thick and heavy with damp. It is not soft, not comfortable, but it traps warmth in a way nothing else could. Beneath it, the linen shift absorbs sweat and moisture, keeping the skin from freezing. It was a simple trick, yet vital. Dry skin survived longer. According to surviving records, medieval soldiers learned to layer their clothing carefully. The outer cloak caught snow and wind, the middle tunic trapped air, and the linen closest to the body managed sweat and friction. It was not elegance that mattered, but endurance. If a soldier's cloak froze stiff in the night, he would thaw it with his own body heat, wearing it until it softened again. The smell of wet wool and sweat became part of life, so familiar that most men stopped noticing it. Oddly, some reports mention that soldiers sometimes stuffed straw or even animal hair between their tunics for insulation. It sounds ridiculous, but the idea worked. The trapped air created a crude but effective thermal barrier. Some chroniclers even noted soldiers sewing extra layers into their sleeves and collars, making their clothing puff out like overfilled sacks. It may have looked absurd, yet warmth was worth any humiliation. Experts continue to question just how effective these early layers truly were. Wool, especially when damp, loses some of its insulating power, and linen absorbs water quickly. Some modern researchers suggest that many soldiers were constantly damp, their body heat locked in a losing battle with moisture. Others argue that the natural oils in medieval wool, unwashed and untreated, actually helped repel rain and frost. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. You stand near a group of archers adjusting their cloaks. Their hands are red and cracked, the skin flaking from cold and friction. One man ties a strip of linen around his fingers to stop them from stiffening. Another rubs his hands with animal fat, a trick he learned from older soldiers. It makes the fingers slick, but keeps the skin from splitting. The air smells faintly of tallow and leather polish. It is fascinating to see how fabric defines the day's rhythm. Soldiers constantly adjust their layers, removing one when marching, adding another at rest. Each layer carries its own sound: the whisper of linen, the muffled swish of wool, the creak of leather belts. You can imagine that soft orchestra filling the air as hundreds of men move in unison, turning the camp into a slow, rustling sea. You touch one soldier's cloak where it hangs beside him. The wool is coarse but densely woven, each fiber holding the faint heat of his body. It feels alive somehow, like a second skin. The edges are frayed from constant use, patched with pieces of different shades. Nothing matches, but everything serves its purpose. Soldiers often scavenged or traded for fabric, caring little about color or pattern. The goal was simple: survive the night. In the ranks of officers, the picture is a little different. Some had fine cloaks lined with fur, rabbit, fox, even wolf, depending on what was available. The furs smelled strong, oily, but they were warm beyond measure. You think of that small privilege, how much it must have meant when the temperature dropped and frost formed on eyelashes. Even a single strip of fur along a collar could make a difference. Contemporary sources confirm that armies often carried bolts of fabric not for fashion, but for survival. Tailors and camp followers cut and sewed constantly, repairing cloaks, replacing torn sleeves, and patching up blankets. The needle was as valuable as the sword in such conditions. You can picture a woman huddled by weak torchlight, mending a tear in a soldier's cloak, her breath misting in the air as she works. The smell of the camp grows stronger as the day drags on. Damp wool, animal fat, and smoke mix into a strange perfume of endurance. You feel it clinging to your hair, your hands, your cloak. It seeps into everything, a reminder that survival always carries a scent. You pause to look at your own reflection in a patch of ice, and for a brief second, the face that looks back could be any soldier from this camp. Eyes rimmed with exhaustion, cheeks raw from wind. You pull the cloak closer, grateful for its imperfect warmth, and think how every thread carries a story. Someone wove this fabric months or years ago, never imagining it would end up wrapped around a soldier sleeping in the snow. Even now, scholars argue over how much these simple fabrics could really protect against the harshness of a medieval winter. Some claim the soldier's resilience came more from the body's adaptation than the material itself. After weeks of exposure, the body learns to conserve energy. The mind dulls to discomfort. Others believe that without wool, many more would have perished. Whatever the truth, you can feel that balance here, the fabric between life and frost. The light fades again as clouds drift across the sky. The camp begins to quiet. You hear the soft rustle of men settling into position, wrapping themselves tightly once more. It is a ritual now, the same gestures repeated night after night. Pull the cloak up, tuck it beneath your chin, curl your knees, exhale, endure. You realize as you watch that these layers of wool and linen are not just physical armor but emotional too. They are a reminder that even in the harshest cold, human beings still cling to small comforts: texture, scent, the feel of something familiar against the skin. It is not enough to make you warm, but enough to make you believe you could be. The sun is long gone now, and the camp breathes quietly under a sheet of frost. You crouch near the edge of a tent where a few men are arranging the ground for the night. The earth is unforgiving, frozen solid and uneven. Every movement sends a dull ache through your knees as you watch them work. They carry handfuls of straw and rushes, muttering under their breath forming clouds in the air. It is well documented that medieval soldiers understood the importance of separating their bodies from the ground. The earth, when cold, steals heat faster than the air. They called it the thief beneath. A soldier who slept directly on the soil could wake with limbs stiff as wood, his blood sluggish from cold. To fight this, they laid down layers of straw, moss, or dry rushes. The idea was simple but effective: create air pockets between the ground and the body to slow the loss of heat. Curiously enough, some soldiers even carried their bedding straw from place to place, bundled in cloth or wrapped in cloaks. After a few nights, it reeked of sweat and smoke, yet it became a trusted companion. The same straw might travel for weeks, flattened, refluffed, and spread again each night. A few men preferred to mix dried herbs with the straw: rosemary, sage, or wild thyme, claiming the scent kept pests away. Whether that worked or not, it must have added a faint touch of comfort to an otherwise miserable sleep. Researchers remain divided on how widespread this practice was. Some accounts suggest only professional soldiers, such as those in standing armies, had the discipline to prepare such bedding regularly. Others argue that even peasant levies, untrained and under-equipped, quickly learned the habit from experience. What seems certain is that the men who ignored it often suffered frostbite or illness. The ground, after all, had no mercy. You reach down and touch a layer of straw yourself. It feels dry and brittle, like a whisper beneath your fingers. The smell rises immediately earthy, faintly sweet, mixed with the musky odor of damp cloth. As you press it, you can hear the soft rustle of stalks breaking. There's something soothing in that sound, like rain tapping lightly on a roof. Nearby, a group of men are debating where to place their tent for the night. They argue quietly, voices hoarse from the cold. One insists on higher ground to avoid melting snow pooling beneath them, while another points toward a hollow, promising shelter from the wind. Both are right, in their own way. A flat spot is a trap for water, but the wind will slice through any low place like a blade. In the end, they compromise, settling for a slight rise beside a clump of bare trees. You sense that every night holds decisions like this, small gambles of comfort and risk. From what chroniclers tell us, camps often smelled of crushed grass and churned mud as soldiers trampled their chosen sites. The process of making a bed was both ritual and necessity. A soldier might kick at the soil to loosen it, lay down straw, then spread his cloak and armor in careful order. Helmets were set near the head, weapons within reach. It was less a bed than a defensive position against both cold and surprise attack. You can picture it clearly: a dozen small shapes beneath a moonlit sky, each one wrapped tightly in a cloak, lying so close together their shoulders touch. The wind sighs through the camp, lifting corners of fabric and carrying faint murmurs of prayer. You hear one man cough, another mutter a curse. Then silence returns, broken only by the faint crunch of frost forming again on the straw. Archaeological finds indicate that the materials used for bedding varied by region. In northern Europe, soldiers relied on straw or hay. In wetter climates, they preferred rushes, which resisted damp. Some accounts from southern campaigns mention pine needles used as insulation, the scent sharp and clean even in freezing air. Imagine lying on a bed that smells faintly of a forest after rain, the needles prickly but warm. Among the stranger tricks, there are mentions of soldiers sleeping on their shields to keep themselves off the ground when no straw was available. The metal or wood was hardly comfortable, but it offered a thin barrier against the chill. Others dug shallow trenches and lined them with cloaks or moss, curling into them like burrowing animals. The ingenuity of desperation is endless. The ground beneath you seems to hum faintly, as though holding centuries of such memories. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine the countless bodies that once rested here or somewhere like it, all breathing the same cold air, all trying to claim a little warmth from an indifferent earth. Some experts continue to wonder how effective these makeshift beds truly were. Perhaps they offered more psychological comfort than real insulation. Even so, that small illusion could make all the difference between despair and endurance. Humans are remarkable in that way. We can trick ourselves into believing comfort exists, and the body follows. A faint snow begins to fall, the flakes drifting down like slow ash. They settle on your cloak, soft and melting. You brush them away gently, thinking about how the same snow once blanketed countless forgotten camps. Each flake a reminder that history is made not only in battles, but in the quiet moments between them, in the way people slept, endured, and waited for morning. You feel the straw shift beneath you as you sit, its warmth faint but real. It is not luxury, but it is enough. The ground no longer feels like an enemy, just another companion in the long, cold night. You take a slow breath, watching it drift into the air like smoke, and for the first time tonight, you almost feel at peace. Night settles again, heavier than before. The sky looks like polished steel, and the cold presses down with quiet authority. You can almost hear it in the stillness, that fragile hush before breath turns visible. Inside the camp, the soldiers have already begun their nightly transformation from weary fighters to bundled shapes of cloth and humanity. You move closer, and your breath mingles with theirs, a faint cloud among hundreds. The tents hold heat for only moments before surrendering it to the air. So the soldiers rely on something far simpler: each other. According to period accounts, body heat was one of the most reliable defenses against freezing nights. 2, sometimes 3 men would sleep side by side under the same cloak, pressed close enough that their combined warmth created a small, humid cocoon. In some military chronicles, the practice is described as lying back to back, heart to heart. There was no shame in it. Pride could wait until spring. Oddly enough, there are notes from certain medieval commanders who forbade soldiers to sleep completely alone, especially during winter campaigns. Isolation, they believed, led not only to cold but to despair. The closeness of other bodies meant life, in both heat and spirit. The smell of another person, their steady breathing, was proof that you were not forgotten in the frost. Modern researchers remain uncertain how comfortable this arrangement really was. Some suggest that the shared warmth was offset by the humidity and the spread of sickness. Others argue that soldiers quickly adjusted, learning to synchronize their breathing and movements through the night to keep from shivering each other awake. Either way, the human instinct to huddle together for warmth may be older than war itself. You sit near a pair of men already preparing to sleep. They pull their cloaks up, edges overlapping like layered feathers. The first man exhales, the other shifts slightly, and soon their breaths merge into a rhythm, a slow, steady fog that hangs beneath the tent roof. The air smells of wool, salt and sweat. You can almost feel it clinging to your own face, heavy and damp. Chroniclers noted that when large groups of men slept in confined spaces, the air itself would thicken. Condensation dripped from the canvas above them, forming tiny rivulets that fell on their faces through the night. Yet, despite the discomfort, those droplets meant warmth. The moisture proved that their combined breath had raised the temperature enough to melt frost. You might say the camp breathed as one organism, each man a lung in a shared body of endurance. One curious detail from old letters tells of soldiers who covered their heads entirely under cloaks, breathing into the small pocket of air they created. It helped recycle warmth, but made the air stale. Some woke gasping, hearts racing. Others swore it gave them strange dreams, visions of fire, voices calling from distant fields, faces of those long dead. Perhaps lack of oxygen made them hallucinate. Perhaps the mind simply wandered to wherever warmth still existed. You listen to the chorus of quiet snores and shifting cloth. The sound is oddly soothing, like waves against the shore. Each movement sends faint ripples through the shared air. A cough here, a sigh there, the rustle of fabric finding comfort against another's shoulder. In the dark, you imagine that they might dream of summer, of meadows, of the warmth of sunlight instead of shared breath. Contemporary observers often remarked on how soldiers seemed to lose their sense of personal space in such conditions. Privacy was a luxury none could afford. They ate together, slept together, even dreamed in rhythm. A man's body was his neighbor's furnace. To turn away was to invite death. You can sense that fragile trust, a silent agreement that no one would move too far, no one would hoard warmth. Some accounts mention that animals, too, were drawn into the equation. Dogs, when present, were allowed to curl beside their masters, their fur adding another layer of living heat. In colder regions, soldiers even shared tents with small livestock, the bleating of goats or the sigh of a horse blending into the night's symphony. The smell was overpowering, but so was the relief of not freezing. There is something deeply human about this picture, the need to share, to survive not as individuals but as clusters of warmth against the endless cold. You imagine yourself among them, feeling another person's heartbeat through layers of cloth, hearing their quiet murmurs in sleep. You realize that this kind of closeness blurs all lines, rank, origin, pride. Everyone becomes equal before the frost. Experts still debate whether this nightly closeness fostered camaraderie or resentment. Some soldiers wrote of bonds stronger than family, while others confessed irritation, sleeplessness, or even shame. Yet all of them agreed on one thing: to sleep alone in a medieval winter camp was to flirt with death. Outside, the wind picks up again, brushing over the tents like a slow tide. It finds every gap, every opening, whispering cold into the warm places. Inside, the men stir slightly, instinctively pressing closer together. Their breaths merge once more, the air fogging again, the warmth fighting back. You step away quietly, your footsteps muffled by frost. Behind you, the murmuring fades into a single soft hum, the collective breathing of men who have learned that survival is not solitude. You look up at the sky, now scattered with pale stars, and think about how something so fragile as breath could hold back the weight of a frozen world. The night stretches longer than it should, each hour dragging like a frozen river refusing to move. You sit near a tent flap, watching the slow rhythm of sleep across the camp. The faint rise and fall of cloaked bodies forms a quiet pattern, broken only by an occasional cough or a muttered dream. The cold seems to seep through everything now, biting even at the air you breathe. You pull your own cloak tighter, the wool rough against your chin. It is clear from old military journals that the cloak was more than just a garment. It was a soldier's shield against the elements, a portable shelter that followed him through mud, snow, and darkness. The best cloaks were thick, heavy with lanolin that repelled water and helped hold warmth. Some were hooded, some pinned with iron clasps or simple cords, depending on what could be afforded or scavenged. You can imagine a man wrapping himself tightly, tucking the edges beneath his knees, his entire body cocooned inside a single piece of fabric. In some regions, soldiers slept using a method called the wrap and tuck. They would lie on their sides, pulling one edge of the cloak under their body, then folding the rest across their shoulders and legs, sealing themselves inside. This created a small pocket of air that the body gradually warmed. The air inside became moist, yes, but far less deadly than the open wind. A curious practice mentioned in letters from the late 15th century describes soldiers warming their cloaks before bed. They would hold them near a dying campfire, careful not to scorch the wool, then wrapped themselves quickly before the heat escaped. The warmth lasted only a few minutes, but those minutes could mean the difference between sleeping and shivering through the dark. Some historians question how long such a cloak could truly provide insulation. Wool, when soaked through, becomes heavy and slow to dry. Yet other researchers note that the natural oils in medieval wool were rarely washed out, giving it a kind of resistance modern fabric lacks. The debate continues in quiet corners of academia, but every account agrees on one thing: the cloak was life. You watch as one man adjusts his cloak in his sleep. It has frozen stiff around the hem, tiny crystals glittering where his breath has condensed. When he moves, the ice cracks softly, a sound like breaking glass. He pulls it closer, half waking, his lips moving in a sleepy whisper before he drifts off again. You can almost feel the weight of that fabric, the faint heat trapped beneath it, the cold pressing down from above. Nearby, another soldier curses under his breath as he shakes out his cloak. It is damp from melted snow, heavy with the stink of smoke and sweat. He lays it across his knees, muttering that it will dry by morning. You know it will not. Still, he sits there, eyes closing, trusting in habit more than logic. A cloak, even soaked, is better than the empty air. In many armies, the cloak also served as a sign of belonging. The colour or weave could mark rank or origin. A knight's cloak might be dyed in his lord's colours, while a common soldier's remained plain grey or brown. Yet when night fell, and the cold became the true enemy, no colour mattered. Cloaks mingled together, noble and poor alike, huddled under the same scraps of wool. You can imagine the equality that frost brings. There are references to soldiers using their cloaks as makeshift sleeping bags, tightening the neck cord and folding the rest under their feet. Some even tied the corners together, sealing themselves completely inside. It was not elegant, but it worked. Others slept sitting up, leaning against their shields, cloak drawn around them like a curtain. The position kept the blood moving and discouraged freezing limbs. Accounts from later centuries mention men waking to find their cloaks frozen to the ground. To move, they had to rip the fabric free, losing chunks of wool to the frost. Yet despite such misery, few ever abandoned the practice. The cloak was too versatile to discard. It was bedding, coat, tent wall, and pillow all in one. You remember something you once read, that soldiers often grew attached to their cloaks as if they were living companions. Some named them, others refused to trade them even for newer ones. The fabric soaked up their sweat, their blood, their breath. It carried their scent, their stories. Perhaps that familiarity gave comfort when everything else was uncertain. A particularly odd story comes from a French chronicle describing soldiers rubbing the inside of their cloaks with animal fat to increase insulation. The fat stiffened the fabric but made it nearly waterproof. It also produced a smell so strong that one chronicler joked, "The enemy could find our tents by scent alone." You can almost laugh, even as the wind cuts across your cheek. The tent around you creaks softly, the poles shuddering as the night deepens. You hear a few men shifting, murmuring in half-sleep. The sound of rustling fabric fills the air like distant waves. You picture hundreds of men wrapped tightly in their cloaks, curled into themselves, guarding small circles of warmth against the indifferent cold. Experts still discuss whether the cloak evolved more from practicality or necessity. Perhaps it was both. You realize now that it is a symbol as much as a tool, a reminder that survival in the medieval world required ingenuity, endurance, and faith in simple things. You look at the man beside you, his face hidden beneath folds of rough wool. His breath rises and falls, slow and steady. Outside, the snow begins again, soft flakes settling on the tent roof. You pull your own cloak tighter, the fabric rough but comforting. There is a strange peace in the cold now, a rhythm that feels eternal. You close your eyes and listen to the gentle sigh of sleeping men wrapped in their faithful second skins. You wake to a muffled groan beside you and realize the sound is not pain but stiffness. The man next to you is trying to move his feet. He pulls one leg, then the other, grimacing as he does. When he finally sits up, the first words that escape his lips are not a prayer but a complaint about his boots. You look down and understand why. They have not left his feet in days. It is clear from multiple campaign records that soldiers often slept with their boots on during the colder months. The reason was brutally simple. Boots removed at night could freeze stiff by morning, or be stolen by desperate men who had lost their own. The ground itself could turn shoes into brittle shells of ice. By keeping them on, soldiers ensured that they could rise and move quickly if danger came. In a winter camp, survival depended as much on readiness as it did on warmth. There are accounts from chroniclers describing the agony of this routine. Leather soaked in melted snow would stiffen around the ankles. Toes would lose feeling, sometimes for good. Soldiers tried to loosen straps before sleeping, just enough to keep blood moving, but rarely dared remove them entirely. The morning ritual of standing up was a test of endurance, each step a negotiation between pain and numbness. A strange little trick some soldiers practiced was to rub their boots with tallow or grease before lying down. It helped keep the leather pliable and added a faint layer of insulation. Others lined their boots with straw, moss, or even scraps of cloth torn from shirts. Anything that kept the feet from freezing was worth trying. You imagine the smell that came from those boots after a week, an odor sharp enough to make even the strongest soldier flinch. Specialists still disagree about how effective such improvisations were. Some claim that constant moisture inside the boots led to infections and trench foot long before that term existed. Others believe that the body adapted, that repeated exposure built a strange kind of tolerance. It is difficult to know for certain. Few men wrote about their feet in letters home. Some things, perhaps, were too unpleasant to record. You watch as a young archer nearby tries to unlace his boots. The leather is so stiff that he needs both hands and the help of a companion to pry it loose. When he finally pulls his foot free, steam rises faintly into the cold air. His toes are red and swollen, the nails darkened. He mutters that they still work, which is good enough. He presses them against the inside of his cloak, trying to coax warmth back into them. In many armies, boots were handed down from one campaign to the next, repaired until nothing but patches remained. A single pair could see multiple winters, stitched and restitched by camp cobblers or the soldiers themselves. The leather grew darker each year, soaked with sweat and oil. When they finally fell apart, men tied them together with strips of cloth or rope. Bare feet on frozen ground were a death sentence. According to contemporary descriptions, officers sometimes wrapped their boots in fur for extra warmth. Common soldiers had no such luxury. They relied on rags stuffed into the gaps or sometimes wore extra layers of socks if they could find them. Wool socks were precious items, often traded or stolen. It is easy to forget how revolutionary a pair of dry socks could feel in a world like this. There are stories of soldiers drying their boots beside smouldering coals, watching them carefully to avoid scorching the leather. Some would place hot stones wrapped in cloth inside to chase away the damp. A few clever ones turned their helmets upside down and set the boots over them like makeshift dryers. You can almost see it, the glow of embers, the smell of singed leather, the quiet satisfaction of small victories. Even with these efforts, many soldiers awoke with their boots frozen to the ground. To stand up meant tearing them free, sometimes leaving pieces of sole behind. One man in a forgotten diary wrote that he could hear the sound of 100 boots cracking like ice on a pond each dawn. The image lingers, half tragic, half absurd. There is another detail that catches your imagination. Some soldiers tied their boots to their legs even while sleeping, afraid they might slip off during restless dreams. They would twist a leather thong around the ankle, ensuring that the boots would stay in place through the night. It speaks to how fragile security was. In that darkness, even losing a shoe could mean never walking again. Archaeological evidence from old encampments reveals impressions in the soil shaped like boots, perfectly preserved by frost. The prints sit close together, overlapping, sometimes forming a circle where men must have sat to warm their feet by invisible fires. It is strange to think that those small hollows once carried the weight of lives marching, fighting, enduring, all with the same worn-out souls. When you look at the men now, huddled together with their boots still on, you understand that comfort was never the goal. Readiness was. A soldier who could rise within seconds might survive a surprise attack or an order to move. Sleep had to bend to the demands of war. A faint wind rises, carrying the dry sound of cracking leather. One man groans softly, adjusting his boots under the blanket of his cloak. You imagine the relief he will feel when spring finally comes, when he can plunge his feet into a stream and feel something other than cold. For now, the boots remain part of the body, heavy and stiff, yet necessary. You pull your own knees close and feel the weight of your footwear pressing down, a reminder of how much the smallest details define endurance. Around you, the soldiers fade back into uneasy sleep, their feet still armored against the night. The frost thickens again, and the camp holds its breath. The camp is quieter tonight, as if exhaustion itself has muffled every sound. The soldiers move with slow, deliberate gestures, each action softened by fatigue. You watch as one man kneels beside his bedroll, tugging at his belt, loosening the straps of his armor. The clatter of metal is faint and careful. He lifts his helmet last, staring into its curved surface for a moment before setting it beside him. For many soldiers, this small ritual signals the approach of rest, a fragile peace before another day of marching. It is mentioned in several chronicles that helmets and saddlebags often became the soldiers' pillows. The ground was too cold, too damp, too unyielding for a bare head. A helmet, turned upside down, created a shallow bowl where a folded cloak or spare tunic could rest. The shape fit the curve of the skull perfectly, lifting the face away from the freezing earth. The idea was practical, even elegant in its simplicity. Curiously, a few soldiers filled their helmets with straw or rags to soften the edges. Others lined them with bits of cloth torn from undergarments. The helmets themselves were rarely clean. They smelled of iron, sweat, and smoke, but that scent was oddly familiar, almost reassuring. Sleeping with one's helmet near the head had another purpose too. If alarm sounded, the soldier could grab it instantly. No searching in the dark, no delay. Some historians suggest that using helmets as pillows was not purely about comfort but about vigilance. To rest one's head upon the very object that saved it in battle was symbolic. It kept the mind half awake, reminding the body that safety was never permanent. Others argue it was simple practicality, an instinct born of necessity. You find truth in both views as you look around the camp and see helmets glinting faintly in the moonlight beside every sleeper. One soldier nearby uses a different approach. He folds his saddle blanket and sets his head on that, with his leather bag tucked beneath. It smells faintly of oats and horse sweat. Horses are tied nearby, their soft snorts and shifting hooves providing a steady rhythm in the background. The bond between man and horse runs deep here. The same saddle that carried him by day now cradles his dreams by night. According to several preserved letters, knights in particular relied on their saddles or riding gear as makeshift bedding. The raised curves supported the neck and shoulders, and the thick leather provided a barrier from the cold ground. Some even used spare bridles as makeshift straps to keep cloaks from slipping away while they slept. To modern ears, it sounds uncomfortable, yet to men hardened by long campaigns, it was luxury. A few accounts speak of soldiers resting their heads on shields instead, the wood still warm from their hands or from the day's sun. Sometimes they turned their shields upright to block wind or snow, creating a kind of personal wall. The image feels almost tender, a warrior wrapped not only in a cloak but in the remnants of battle, his tools turned into guardians for the night. There is a faint rustle behind you as another man settles himself. He places his helmet near his chest instead of under his head, one arm draped over it like a keepsake. Perhaps he has grown superstitious. Many soldiers did. Some believed their armor carried luck, that to keep it close while sleeping would ward off unseen dangers. It is a small comfort, the kind only fear can justify. The chroniclers who followed armies often described the sight of 100 helmets arranged in neat rows beside sleeping men. By morning, frost would collect along the rims, sparkling in the first light. The effect was said to be beautiful in a grim way, as if the field were filled with sleeping knights made of ice. You can almost picture it now, the moonlight catching each curve of metal, a quiet forest of steel beneath the stars. Archaeological discoveries have unearthed helmets dented not only from battle, but from repeated use as makeshift bowls, stools, and pillows. It seems the helmet was a companion through every part of a soldier's life. To lie down and rest one's head upon it was simply one more act of intimacy between man and metal. A detail found in a lesser-known diary mentions that on especially cold nights, soldiers warmed small stones by the fire and placed them inside their helmets before sleeping. The heat lingered for an hour or two, enough to ease the shock of the first stretch of rest. Of course, some misjudged the heat and woke to the smell of scorched cloth or singed hair. You smile at the thought, amused at how desperation breeds both cleverness and folly. Scholars continue to discuss whether such improvised methods offered real relief or merely postponed discomfort. Some point out that these men slept in shifts, never long enough to suffer deeply. Others argue that even a few hours of partial rest was critical to maintaining strength. Whatever the case, there is something quietly heroic in their determination to adapt, to find sleep in a world designed to deny it. The camp grows still again. You listen to the creak of leather, the distant stamp of a horse, the soft sighs of men drifting between waking and dreaming. You imagine the warmth of a helmet under your head, the faint metallic chill of it seeping into your cheek, the echo of battles past vibrating in the steel. It is strangely comforting, as if history itself hums beneath your ear. Somewhere, a man mumbles a prayer before sleep, his voice nearly lost in the wind. Another turns over, his armor clinking faintly. The sound is gentle, familiar, almost musical. It tells you that even here, surrounded by cold and hardship, there is rhythm, there is ritual, and there is rest. You lie back on the ground, your head against an imagined helmet, and let your eyes close. The stars above look like small fires frozen in the sky. The earth beneath you is hard, the air sharp, but you breathe evenly now, in time with the sleeping camp. The night feels endless, yet somehow peaceful, held together by the quiet bond of men and the things that carried them through. The camp lives in rhythm with the darkness. The night is not a single stretch of sleep, but a pattern of waking and waiting, of cold duty and fragile dreams. Somewhere near the center of the camp, a horn gives a low, trembling note, a watchman's call. One shift ends, another begins. The soldiers who had been resting stir reluctantly, pulling their cloaks tighter before crawling from their shelters into the bitter wind. You watch them rise like ghosts from the earth, boots crunching softly on frozen mud. It is written in many military chronicles that the night watch was both a punishment and an honor. The task of keeping the camp alive in the hours when sight failed and imagination took over required courage. Each man took his turn, whether knight or commoner, for no one was above the danger that came when sleep pulled too deep. The rotation kept discipline sharp. It also gave soldiers a strange kind of awareness, a reminder that the dark was never empty. According to some preserved records, these shifts could last 2 hours or more. The men on duty paced around the perimeter of the camp, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs. Their job was simple: keep the fires from dying if allowed, keep their comrades from freezing, and most importantly, keep their eyes open. The hardest part was not the cold but the silence. The world felt hollow at night, the stars distant and indifferent, the land vast enough to swallow sound. Curiously enough, there were small tricks to surviving these hours. Some soldiers chewed on hard bread or pebbles to stay awake, the movement keeping their jaws from stiffening. Others sang softly to themselves or muttered prayers under their breath. There are mentions in a few accounts of watchmen whispering stories or riddles to one another across the dark, tiny threads of humanity stretched between the shadows. Modern researchers often discuss how exhausting this routine must have been. Few soldiers could ever sleep deeply, knowing their turn on watch would come soon. The mind learned to rest in fragments, to drift lightly but never fall completely into dreams. Fatigue became a constant companion. Still, every army maintained the rotation, because the alternative, sleeping without guard, invited disaster. You can picture the watchmen now, cloaks wrapped tight, halberds or spears in hand, their breath rising in soft clouds. One stops near a cluster of tents and listens. Inside, men snore softly, shifting beneath their covers. He smiles faintly, perhaps envying their warmth. Another passes by the horses, running a gloved hand along their flanks. The animals shift but do not startle. Even they have learned the rhythm of this place. A letter from a Burgundian soldier mentions that some watchmen rubbed their hands with ashes or held cold stones to their faces when drowsiness threatened. The shock kept them alert for a few more minutes. Others pinched their arms or whispered the names of family members, as if calling them back from memory could keep the eyelids open. You can almost feel that battle against sleep, the eyelids heavy, the knees trembling, the body begging to rest while the mind repeats, "Not yet." According to period accounts, commanders would sometimes walk the lines themselves, silent as shadows, testing the vigilance of their men. A soldier caught sleeping on watch faced severe punishment. Some were made to stand barefoot in the snow, others beaten or bound for hours. It was harsh, but in the brutal logic of war, one man's drowsiness could doom hundreds. There is something eerie about the sound of the watch at night. The faint jingle of metal as a guard shifts his spear, the creak of leather as he moves, the crunch of frozen ground beneath slow steps. Every sound feels amplified in the cold. You find yourself holding your breath, listening too. Far off, a wolf howls, its cry thin and haunting. A few horses stir uneasily. The guards exchange glances, but say nothing. It is not the first time, and it will not be the last. Some chronicles describe how the stars became companions for these lonely men. They learned to read their patterns, to measure time by their slow march across the sky. In that darkness, the heavens were both clock and comfort. One soldier wrote that when he stared long enough at the stars, he could almost feel warmth from their light. You like the thought, even if science would argue otherwise. Sometimes belief itself keeps a person alive. The routine of the watch had another effect as well. It bound the men together. Those who shared these cold hours developed quiet friendships, forged not through words but through shared endurance. They saw each other at their weakest, blinking back sleep, shivering in silence. By dawn, when they returned to the tents, they carried that bond back into the day. A few historians question whether the watch system was as strict in every army. Some argue that smaller or poorly organized forces could not maintain it, leaving camps vulnerable. Others point to the consistent pattern of success in disciplined units, suggesting that the simple act of staying awake in rotation separated survival from ruin. The truth likely varied from place to place, from one night to the next. You step closer to the edge of the camp now, where the last line of guards stands. The air feels heavier here, as if even the stars hesitate to intrude. One man glances at you and nods before continuing his slow pacing. His spear tip gleams faintly in the moonlight. You wonder what he is thinking, perhaps of home, perhaps of the warmth he will never feel tonight. When the horn sounds again, low and distant, the next watch begins. The tired guards return, their movements stiff, faces pale with cold. They crawl into the tents, curling beside the sleepers, their breath joining the slow rhythm of the camp once more. The new guards take their places, boots crunching softly as they vanish into the dark. The pattern continues, hour after hour, a heartbeat against the silence. You settle near the edge of a tent, listening to the changing steps beyond. Each footfall feels like the ticking of a clock, ancient and endless. Sleep comes lightly now, carried on the rhythm of vigilance. You understand that this balance between waking and dreaming is what keeps them alive. The night is long, but it will end. It always does. The night grows darker still, though the air seems lighter somehow, touched by the quiet sound of horses breathing. You walk between the rows of animals, their shapes dim and peaceful in the half-light. Their breath rises in clouds, their bodies radiating a steady warmth that feels alive, even gentle. You realize that in this frozen world, the horses are more than beasts of burden. They are lifelines, sharing their heat with the men who depend on them. According to accounts from medieval campaigns, soldiers often slept near their horses in winter camps. The animals' massive bodies created a warm pocket of air, and their presence offered comfort as well as security. A good horse could sense movement long before its rider woke, snorting or stamping to warn of danger. To rest beside such a creature was both practical and reassuring. There are even stories of soldiers leaning against their horses while sitting or half sleeping, their cloaks draped across both man and beast. The shared heat could make the difference between waking alive or not waking at all. The smell was unmistakable, a mixture of sweat, leather, and hay, but in that world, such smells meant survival. Curiously, some letters from mounted knights describe brushing down their horses before sleep to warm their own hands. The friction of the coarse hair and the animal's living heat provided relief after hours in the cold. Others fed their mounts the last of the camp's oats or shared pieces of bread soaked in wine, a quiet exchange of gratitude between companions who had carried each other through battle. Modern researchers still discuss how far this bond extended. Some argue that practical necessity drove it, that horses were simply part of the machinery of war. Others believe a deeper relationship existed, one born of trust and familiarity. In the dark, it hardly matters which is true. You see it here, the soldier resting his head against the animal's neck, whispering softly before closing his eyes. Both are tired, both endure. A chronicler from the Crusades wrote that horses sometimes slept standing, heads lowered, eyes half closed, swaying gently. The men around them learned to mimic this strange rhythm, drifting into half sleep beside the moving warmth. Imagine that quiet scene, dozens of animals shifting in the dark, tails flicking softly, soldiers curled at their feet, all breathing in a single slow rhythm. There is an odd comfort in the sound of their breathing. You listen to it now, a deep, steady exhale followed by a soft snort. Occasionally, one stamps a hoof, the sound echoing across the frozen ground. The air smells of hay, frost, and life. For a moment, you forget how cold it is. In some armies, horses were covered with blankets or rough cloth at night, but those were luxuries not every soldier enjoyed. Many simply relied on the animal's thick winter coat to survive. The men who tended them sometimes wrapped their own cloaks around both themselves and the horse, creating a strange, shared cocoon. You picture it now, a soldier pressed close to his mount, the faint rise and fall of two bodies keeping time together. A peculiar anecdote appears in a German knight's diary, describing how soldiers in desperate conditions allowed their horses to stand inside the outer tents. It was dangerous, the chronicler admits, since a startled animal could trample a man in his sleep, but the warmth was irresistible. In those moments, tents became stables, and men and animals shared the same breath until morning. Archaeological traces from old encampments sometimes reveal the imprint of hooves beside sleeping areas, suggesting this was not uncommon. The bond between soldier and horse was etched directly into the frozen ground. You can almost feel that connection yourself. When you reach out, your hand meets the coarse, warm coat of a bay mare. She flicks an ear and breathes softly, her nose damp against your sleeve. Her warmth feels alive, not just physical but somehow emotional. She lowers her head slightly, as if acknowledging your presence. You stand there together, two beings sharing one small oasis of heat in a vast, indifferent night. The soldiers who sleep near the horses look oddly peaceful. One man lies curled beside a gelding, his cloak pulled up over both of them. Another leans against a saddle propped near his horse's flank, his helmet resting on his chest. It is easy to forget that these same animals carried them through storms of arrows and mud just days before. In the dark, the violence of daylight fades, leaving only companionship. Experts continue to study how soldiers manage such arrangements without chaos. Some think there were unspoken rules. Each man knew his place. Each horse trusted its rider. Others suspect that years of familiarity forged a quiet language between them, a series of gestures and sounds that kept harmony even in exhaustion. Whatever the truth, it worked often enough to become tradition. You listen again, and the night is full of subtle sounds, the rustle of hay, the flick of tails, the soft clink of bridles shifting in sleep. The camp might be frozen, but this corner still feels alive, breathing, connected. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine what it must have been like to rest against that steady warmth, to feel a living heart just inches from your own. When morning comes, these same horses will bear weight again, trudging across ice and mud, carrying men back into danger. Yet for now, they are still. You can see frost forming along their manes, a thin line of silver that glitters in the moonlight. One exhales sharply, shaking its head, and snow scatters like sparks. You realize that in this place, the horses are not just animals but reminders of home, of softness, of endurance that asks for nothing in return. As you step back from the corral, the warmth fades, but the feeling lingers, a quiet respect for those who found comfort in the heartbeat of another living creature when the world around them froze. The camp settles deeper into silence, men and horses dreaming together, their shared breath rising into the cold, clear air. You pull your cloak closer and let your eyes close, still hearing the low, patient rhythm of life in the dark. By the next night, the snow has thickened into soft drifts that blur the edges of every tent and boot print. The air feels quieter, as though the world has been wrapped in wool. You walk through the camp, and each step sinks with a muted crunch. The men are already preparing their shelters, but something about their movements is different tonight. Instead of fighting the snow, they are shaping it. It is noted in several campaign records that soldiers sometimes let snow itself become part of their protection. The frozen air was merciless, yet snow could insulate better than open wind. Men quickly learned that a tent buried in white stayed warmer than one exposed to air. The packed snow trapped heat, sealing the warmth inside like a primitive cocoon. It is one of those quiet contradictions of nature that soldiers understood long before science explained it. According to descriptions in Nordic military chronicles, soldiers often piled snow around the lower edges of their tents, pressing it tight like mortar. The effect was immediate. The wind howled above, but could no longer crawl beneath. Some men even allowed drifts to rise halfway up the canvas, creating domes of white that glittered faintly in moonlight. The tents became part of the landscape, almost invisible from afar. A curious practice described in certain letters tells of soldiers deliberately covering their tents after nightfall, shoveling snow over them until only the peaks showed. Inside, the temperature rose enough that water droplets formed on the inner walls. The air was damp, but still warmer than outside. It was survival, not comfort, but in a world ruled by frost, that difference mattered more than anything. Experts still discuss how common this habit truly was. Some argue that only armies from colder climates used it regularly, while others believe it was a universal trick learned through necessity. There is evidence that even southern European soldiers experimented with similar methods during harsh winters. Snow, after all, cared little for geography. You watch as a group of men pack snow around their tent. Their hands are red and raw, fingers stiff from work, yet they move with practiced ease. One man grins and says something about building a castle of ice. The others laugh softly, their voices carrying like distant bells. It is strange how laughter survives in conditions like this, how it becomes its own form of fire. The snow thickens, falling in slow, deliberate flakes. Each one catches the faint light from the torches before vanishing into the mass below. The camp transforms around you, shapes becoming softer, quieter, as if swallowed by sleep itself. There are reports from Byzantine sources describing similar shelters made directly from snow. Soldiers would dig small hollows, covering the openings with cloaks or shields. Inside, they lit small candles or lanterns to add warmth. The air inside became heavy with smoke, but the glow gave both light and comfort. Imagine the sight. A flicker of gold hidden within a mound of snow, the sound of breathing just beneath the surface. One detail preserved in a Scandinavian saga tells of men sleeping inside snow pits lined with pine branches. The branches kept their bodies from touching the ice and filled the air with a clean, resinous scent. You can almost smell it now, sharp and green, cutting through the dull musk of wool and leather. Not every attempt ended well. Some soldiers packed their tents too tightly and woke gasping for air. Others underestimated the weight of snow and found their shelters collapsing under its pressure. Yet for every failure, there were countless quiet successes nights survived by ingenuity rather than strength. It is easy to imagine the moment just before sleep. The air inside a snow-covered tent is thick and still, the darkness almost complete. You can hear your own breathing louder than the wind outside. The walls of snow muffle every sound, turning the world distant and strange. Even the howls of wolves fade into nothing. It feels safe, in a fragile, temporary way. Some modern historians note how this method resembles the techniques used by northern tribes and later explorers. It is possible that medieval soldiers learned by observing others, borrowing survival skills wherever war carried them. Survival, after all, ignores pride. Knowledge passed quietly from one people to another, often in the simplest of gestures, a way of building, a way of sleeping. You kneel and run your fingers along the packed snow. It is smooth, faintly warm to the touch where body heat has softened it. Inside, a soldier snores softly, his face calm for the first time in days. The light from a candle flickers against the inner wall, casting a gentle amber glow on the snow's surface. It looks like carved glass, fragile yet strong. Outside, the world is dark and endless. The snow continues to fall, covering footprints, silencing the echoes of war. You realize that beneath these drifts lie hundreds of men, each sealed in his own small pocket of warmth. The thought feels oddly comforting, as if the earth itself has chosen to protect them for one night. There is something almost sacred in this image. The same snow that buries the dead also shelters the living. It becomes a symbol of endurance, of how the line between danger and safety can shift with nothing but a change in perspective. What once killed now preserves. As the hours pass, the camp becomes invisible under the growing layers of white. Only faint humps mark where tents once stood. The wind howls over the surface, but inside, the men breathe in rhythm, the snow holding their heat close. You listen to that silence, deep and perfect, and understand that this is how they survived winter without fire, by turning the cold itself into an ally. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine that same stillness wrapping around you. The air grows heavy, the sounds fade, and all that remains is the slow heartbeat of life beneath the snow. When the snow settles and the wind fades, the camp takes on an eerie calm. The men have learned to move quietly in this white silence, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace that frost has laid upon them. You wander between the tents, feeling the air thicken with scent. It is a mixture of leather, smoke, wool, and sweat, heavy and human. This is what survival smells like. Chroniclers of the time wrote that winter camps were as much about endurance of the senses as of the body. The damp air trapped every odor, holding it close like a second skin. Without steady fires to clear the air, the smell of men and iron mixed until the two became indistinguishable. The scent of rusted mail and unwashed flesh was the perfume of the army. You breathe it in now, and it sits dense on your tongue. Curiously, some accounts from medieval physicians describe how soldiers tried to disguise or soften this stench. They rubbed their hands with crushed herbs when available, or carried sprigs of rosemary or lavender tucked into belts. It was not vanity but necessity. The strong smell of decay and sweat was thought to attract illness or evil spirits, and in those long nights, Superstition was as common as breath. Researchers continue to discuss how unbearable these conditions truly were. Some suggest the men simply stopped noticing, their senses dulled by repetition. Others argue that the constant stink became a kind of reassurance, proof that they were still alive, still warm enough to sweat. You can imagine that small comfort, the bitter sweetness of existence itself. The tents, lined with wool and canvas, hold the scent of the day inside. The mingled breath of men turns to moisture, which freezes and thaws again, layering each wall with thin films of ice. When touched, the surface crackles softly, releasing a faint metallic tang. It is as if the air itself has memory. You lift a corner of one tent flap and look inside. The darkness is dense, pierced only by the faint glow of an oil lamp. The flame quivers against the damp air. 4 men lie side by side, wrapped in their cloaks. Their armor is stacked neatly beside them, dark with condensation. The smell inside is stronger here, almost overwhelming. You close your eyes for a moment and try to separate the notes. The sourness of sweat, the animal musk of wool, the faint sharpness of iron. Together they form a strange harmony, unpleasant but honest. A chronicler from the English campaigns once compared the scent of winter camps to that of a forge after rain. He wrote that it clings to the soul as it clings to the cloak. You understand what he meant. It is the smell of work and struggle, of men who do not have the luxury of distance from the earth. In some armies, attempts were made to improve the air. Commanders ordered tents aired out whenever the weather allowed, though that meant losing precious warmth. Others scattered dried herbs on the ground, or burned small pieces of resin to mask the stench, but mostly they endured it. Smell, like hunger, became another battlefield. A peculiar note from a Florentine observer mentions that soldiers sometimes slept beside their weapons simply because the smell of oiled metal felt cleaner than their own bodies. They polished blades before sleeping, the scent of oil and iron mingling with the reek of men. The ritual was practical, but also psychological. Clean steel was a reminder of purpose, of discipline. It was one small part of the self that did not decay. Experts still argue about whether such close quarters led to frequent illness. Some claim the confined spaces bred infection, while others note that the cold limited the spread of disease. Whatever the truth, the men learned to ignore discomfort. The nose, after all, adapts to what it cannot escape. Outside, the smell changes subtly with the air. The horses add their own musk, deep and organic, while the wind carries hints of frozen soil. You realize that every scent in this place tells a story. The sour breath of a man sleeping too close, the tang of sweat dried on wool, the faint sweetness of straw. Each odor becomes part of a language of survival, one you begin to understand without words. You crouch near a pile of discarded equipment, and the smell of rust greets you first. A few iron buckles lie half buried in frost, their surfaces blooming orange where damp has eaten through. You pick one up, feel its roughness, and the scent of decay clings to your fingers. It is the same smell that lingers on the men themselves, the scent of life slowly oxidizing in the cold. There are moments, though, when another fragrance cuts through it all. Someone somewhere has lit a small candle made of tallow. The air carries a faint sweetness, animal and earthy. It mixes with the human odor and softens it, reminding you that warmth can come even from what is unpleasant. You think of how the soldiers might have grown attached to these smells. After months of hardship, the scent of the camp became home. To return to it after battle was to know safety. It is strange how the body learns to love what once disgusted it, but that, too, is part of endurance. The snow outside absorbs every sound but cannot hide the truth of presence. Even in the darkest hour, the scent of the living hangs in the air, defying the cold. You breathe deeply and accept it as they did, the mingled perfume of survival and decay, proof that life, however grim, persists. As the night deepens, you step back from the tents, and the wind shifts. For a moment, the smell thins, replaced by the clean bite of frozen air. Then the camp exhales again, and the world returns to its human fragrance. You close your eyes and listen to the silence, feeling that odd comfort of being surrounded by life in its rawest form. By the time the sky fades to a dull grey, the soldiers begin to stir. The night's cold has clung to every joint and seam of fabric, and movement comes slowly. You hear the sound of someone coughing, another man stretching until his armor creaks. Then comes the unmistakable scent of food, faint but immediate, winding through the camp like a promise. It is well recorded in chronicles from many armies that food was the only warmth a soldier could count on. Fire was forbidden on some nights to avoid giving away their position, yet hunger demanded attention. The men learned to cook in secret, or not at all. Cold rations were common, but when permitted, even a weak stew became a treasure. You watch as a few soldiers huddle over a small pot, its surface barely steaming. Inside, the mixture is simple: bits of salted meat, barley, and water thickened by long boiling. The smell is humble but comforting, a whisper of hearths left far behind. One man dips a wooden spoon, tastes and sighs. The warmth that spreads through him seems to loosen his entire body. Curiously, soldiers sometimes used their helmets as makeshift pots. They would fill them with snow to melt into water, then toss in whatever they had: roots, dried peas, shreds of meat, even stale bread. The practice was frowned upon by officers, but too practical to stop. The result was often gritty, metallic soup, yet it gave enough heat to steady a man's hands before sleep. Experts remain divided on how nourishing these meals truly were. Some say the soldiers lived on little more than salted rations and thin broth, barely enough to sustain them through endless marches. Others argue that soldiers found ways to stretch what they had, trading with locals, hunting small game, or scavenging supplies from the land. You imagine the satisfaction of catching even a single rabbit in the snow, the brief luxury of fresh meat shared among friends. The men here have a small pile of bread as well, hard as stone but softened by dipping into the stew. One tears a piece and passes it to his companion without a word. You can see how hunger unites them more deeply than orders ever could. The steam from the pot rises between them like a fragile bond, their faces glowing faintly in its warmth. In some regions, ale or watered wine accompanied these meals, not for indulgence, but for safety. The alcohol killed what the water could not. Soldiers often described that first swallow after a day's silence as a miracle. You can almost taste it yourself: the sour tang, the faint heat sliding down the throat and waking something buried deep inside. A peculiar account from an Italian mercenary mentions the use of snow as both ingredient and tool. When no water was available, snow filled the pot. When there was too much smoke, snow muffled it. Sometimes, soldiers cooled their burning mouths with a handful of it, laughing at the absurdity. Even the cold could become part of the meal. There were small rituals, too. Before eating, some men murmured quick prayers to St. Lawrence, patron of cooks and sufferers of heat. Others muttered thanks to no one in particular, simply grateful for something warm to hold. The sound of spoons scraping the sides of pots filled the camp, an orchestra of survival. The smell of food travelled fast, slipping between tents and along frozen paths. It mingled with the scents of leather and iron, weaving a thin thread of humanity through the frozen air. You find yourself drawn to it, the way warmth draws all living things. According to one chronicler from the 100 Years' War, the richest smell in camp came from fat sizzling in a pan, rare as it was. Men would gather instinctively around the sound, even when they knew there was not enough to share. The smell alone could feed the imagination, stirring memories of home. Some soldiers carried small pouches of spices looted from markets: pepper, cumin, or saffron, if they were lucky. A pinch transformed a plain meal into something extraordinary. You picture one soldier sprinkling spice into his bowl with quiet pride, watching the others smile at the hint of flavor. It is a reminder that even here, refinement had not vanished entirely. There are letters describing the quiet after supper, when men felt warmth for the first time all day. They sat in silence, staring at the empty pots, letting the heat in their bellies spread outward. It was not enough to conquer the cold, but enough to believe they could. Hunger had been defeated, at least for a few hours. Modern readers may underestimate the power of those small comforts. A single hot meal could restore morale, remind a man that he was still part of something living. The taste of salt and fat could turn despair into endurance. Historians note that some of the longest sieges were survived not through strategy, but through the ability to make a handful of ingredients feel like abundance. As the men finish eating, they wipe their hands on their cloaks and share what remains of the bread. A few save scraps for the next day, wrapping them in bits of cloth. One man hums softly as he eats, a tune so faint you can barely hear it. It is not joy exactly, but relief. The sound settles in your chest like warmth itself. You notice how the steam from the pot hangs in the air long after the fire dies, a ghostly echo of the meal. It curls upward and disappears, but the feeling it leaves behind remains. You realize that warmth is not only a matter of temperature, it is a memory, a moment that lingers in the body even after the cold returns. The soldiers stretch out again, bellies full enough to soften their edges. Some yawn, some smile, faintly before drifting towards sleep. The smell of stew still clings to their clothes, blending with the frost. You close your eyes and imagine the taste, the faint salt on your tongue, the heat sliding down your throat. It is simple, but it feels like grace. The camp settles into a slow rhythm again after the meal, bellies full and spirits faintly lifted. The fireless night stretches ahead, but something lighter fills the air now. You walk through the rows of tents and hear low voices carrying through the dark, not in conversation but in song. It begins softly, one man humming a tune that sounds older than memory, and then another joins in. Soon the sound weaves through the camp like smoke. Chroniclers often noted that soldiers sang in winter camps, not out of joy but out of defiance. Music warmed what fires could not. The melodies were simple, built for tired throats and cold hands. Some were prayers disguised as songs, others were marching tunes slowed to lullabies. The rhythm kept the men's hearts steady in a world that seemed to have stopped beating. A curious entry in a French captain's journal mentions that soldiers sang to measure time during their watches. A verse might last as long as a patrol, and when it ended, another man took over. The sound reassured those half asleep that someone still stood awake. The camp became a living heartbeat of music, fragile but constant. It is fascinating to think of voices replacing warmth. The body shivers, but the mind begins to calm as song fills the space where fear used to be. You hear it now, the uneven chorus of men who know they are off key but sing anyway. Their words slip between languages, old Latin prayers mixing with rustic tongues. Even those who do not know the lyrics hum along, following the rise and fall of sound like a tide. Some letters from the late Middle Ages describe bawdy songs too, rough humor born from hardship. Soldiers laughed quietly at jokes that would have earned punishment by day. There was safety in the dark, a freedom to be human again. For a few moments, rank dissolved. Knight and archer, noble and peasant, all were just voices in the same fragile harmony. Experts continue to discuss what kind of songs were most common. Some point to religious hymns, suggesting that faith anchored the weary. Others believe that popular folk tunes dominated, carried from taverns to battlefields. It is likely both were true, for soldiers were men of contradictions, praying one minute, jesting the next, always clinging to whatever made the night shorter. You pause beside one tent where the song grows louder. Inside, 5 men sit close together, their faces dimly lit by a single candle stub. One taps a rhythm on his knee, another keeps time with a spoon against a cup. The sound is soft but rhythmic, echoing off the canvas like rain on a roof. The tune they sing tells of spring, of green fields and warm winds. It is a cruel kind of hope, but they sing it anyway. According to certain accounts from the Crusades, soldiers sometimes sang in languages none of them fully understood. The words had been learned by ear, passed along from one army to another, reshaped by memory. Meaning mattered less than sound. In the long silence of the night, melody itself became prayer. You realize that song also served a practical purpose. It helped mark identity. Each group of men had its own refrain, its own rhythm. To hear it in the distance meant safety. To hear silence where it should have been meant something had gone wrong. Music became both shield and signal. There is one description from an Italian chronicler who claimed that during a particularly brutal winter siege, both sides sang across the snow. Enemies, separated by walls and ice, trading songs instead of arrows for a few hours. It is impossible to prove, yet the image lingers. Two armies sharing the same rhythm beneath the same stars, their breath forming the same pale mist in the air. A peculiar story from a monk who traveled with soldiers tells of men singing to the horses to keep them calm during blizzards. The monk wrote that the animals would sway gently, tails flicking in rhythm, as if they too understood the comfort of a tune. You smile at the thought how music bridges everything alive. Modern scholars sometimes argue whether these moments of music had real effect on morale or were simply habits to fill silence. But as you listen now, the answer feels obvious. The camp is warmer, if only in spirit. The men's laughter after each verse rings quietly but clearly, rippling across the snow like a candle flame carried by wind. The melody shifts. One voice begins a slower tune, softer, more fragile. It sounds like a lullaby, though no child is here to hear it. The others join, their voices dropping to whispers by the last line. The sound fades into the air and vanishes completely, leaving only the sigh of wind against the tents. For a moment, the night feels lighter. You think of how sound itself becomes warmth. A song holds the memory of heat, even when no fire burns. The heart listens, the body believes, and the world feels a little less cold. The men settle back, eyes half closed, smiles faint and tired but real. Some hum as they drift towards sleep, their voices merging with the slow rhythm of breathing across the camp. The stars are brighter now, untouched by cloud. You tilt your head back and imagine those same stars listening centuries ago, hearing the same worn melodies rising through the frost. It is a comforting thought that sound outlasts everything, that even the faintest voice carries across time. You sit quietly for a while, letting the echo fade. Then, somewhere in the dark, another song begins, quiet and familiar. You cannot tell who starts it, but the tone is gentle, almost like a sigh. You close your eyes, and for the first time tonight, it feels easy to rest. The music drifts through you like warmth itself, soft and human, keeping the cold at bay. When the last song fades into silence, the darkness settles heavy again, and the men retreat into themselves. You walk among the tents, and the sounds change. Less music now, more whispers. These are not songs but quiet words to unseen listeners. Some men pray, others mutter to charms or tokens hung around their necks. You realize that faith, in all its strange shapes, is as present here as the snow. It is noted in many period writings that medieval soldiers depended as much on belief as on rations or weapons. The cold could not be fought by strength alone, so they turned to what they understood best: ritual and superstition. A man might wear a small cross sewn into his cloak, or a coin touched by a priest before battle. Others kept bones, carved symbols, or scraps of parchment scrawled with verses. These small objects were warmth for the spirit, invisible shields against the unseen. According to certain monastic accounts, soldiers prayed before sleep, not always to win battles, but to survive the night. They asked for dreams instead of death, for warmth instead of glory. The words were simple, murmured half in habit, half in hope. You can almost hear them now, the faint repetition of "Protect me, Lord," carried on the slow rhythm of the wind. A curious record from a Spanish chronicler tells of soldiers hanging charms made of twisted iron wire above their tents to keep away cold spirits. Others carried fragments of saints' relics, believing the heat of holiness could shield them. One man wrote that he slept each night with a rosary wrapped around his wrist because the touch of the beads was the same as touching home. Researchers continue to discuss whether these rituals were purely symbolic or had psychological power. Some scholars claim faith gave structure to chaos, helping men endure what reason could not. Others argue it was simply a matter of habit, gestures performed to fill the silence. Whatever the explanation, the effect is unmistakable. You can feel the quiet confidence in their movements, the stillness of those who have given fear to something greater than themselves. Not all beliefs were Christian. Soldiers carried the remnants of older traditions, bits of folklore and magic absorbed from villages and hillsides. A Saxon archer might whisper charms against frostbite. A French mercenary might spit into the snow before lying down, thinking it would confuse demons. A Hungarian horseman might tie a red thread around his wrist to ward off sickness. None of them would speak openly about it, but every camp held its private mysteries. There are mentions in several chronicles of soldiers fearing the presence of night spirits, shadows that fed on breath. Men covered their faces while sleeping to protect their souls from being drawn out. Some even painted small crosses on the inside of their tent walls with soot and grease, a dark blessing no one spoke of in daylight. An especially peculiar detail from an Italian observer describes how soldiers melted snow to wash their hands before prayer, calling it the cleansing of the frost. The gesture was more symbolic than practical, but it carried meaning. Cold water on bare skin in such weather must have stung like fire, yet they did it anyway. Perhaps it reminded them that pain could purify. Historians remain uncertain how organized these nightly devotions were. Some believe officers led collective prayers, while others insist faith was personal, each man speaking quietly to his own God. It seems likely both occurred, shifting with mood and circumstance. In some armies, chaplains moved through the tents offering blessings. In others, silence was preferred, a more private communion. You crouch beside a small group gathered in prayer. Their heads are bowed, hands clasped tightly. The candle between them trembles in the draught, its flame barely holding. They are not asking for victory tonight. You can tell by the way their eyes stay closed long after the words end. They are asking for dawn, for breath, for the strength to wake. A monk who once travelled with soldiers wrote that he envied their faith because it was forged in cold and danger. He meant that belief refined itself when tested by discomfort. In a warm monastery, prayer might be routine. Here, each word spoken through chattering teeth feels earned. You nod to yourself, understanding. There are also stories of men who rejected prayer altogether, yet carried habits of it anyway. They cursed loudly by day and fell silent by night, their hands still moving in patterns learned as children. Perhaps faith never truly leaves, only hides until it is needed. The wind outside grows stronger, rattling the tents like distant thunder. Inside, the men shift closer to one another, murmuring final words before lying down. Some kiss their charms, others press their fingers to small crosses, others simply close their eyes and trust that something unseen still watches. You notice one soldier lying apart, staring upward. His lips move, but no sound escapes. His eyes are fixed on the roof of the tent, following the flicker of shadows cast by the candle. He might be praying, or he might just be thinking. Perhaps the two are the same. A faint calm spreads through the camp. The prayers fade, the wind steadies, and a strange peace settles over the sleeping men. Faith has done its work. It has quieted the mind, if not the cold. You feel it too, a softness that has nothing to do with temperature. As the candle gutters out, the last light falls across a scattering of charms on the ground, iron wires, beads, bits of bone. They glimmer briefly, catching what remains of the flame, then fade into the dark. Outside, snow begins to fall again, silent as blessing. You close your eyes and let the silence rest on you like a prayer you never learned, but somehow understand. In this cold world, belief is warmth, even when it cannot be seen. The night deepens until the air feels like glass. sharp enough to cut each breath. Around you, the camp is still, but inside the tents the men begin to drift toward dreams. The human mind, when pressed by exhaustion, becomes a strange landscape. It wanders where the body cannot. You can almost feel it happening now, the slow unraveling of thought as soldiers sink into uneasy sleep. Accounts from medieval campaigns reveal that soldiers often dreamed vividly during the coldest months. Hunger, fear, and sleeplessness carved strange images into their minds. One knight wrote that winter dreams were half born of prayer and half of frost. They blurred memory, longing, and imagination until all became one. The body shivered while the mind wandered home. Some surviving letters describe dreams filled with food and warmth. Men saw themselves sitting before blazing hearths, drinking wine that never cooled, laughing with faces they barely remembered. Others dreamed of endless fields, of sunlight falling on armor without weight. But there were darker visions too. Many wrote of battles replayed again and again, of unseen enemies, of cries echoing through snow. Sleep did not always bring rest. Curiously, a few chroniclers believed that dreams could predict survival. A soldier who dreamed of fire was thought likely to live through the winter, while one who dreamed of drowning or falling through ice was said to be doomed. Men shared these dreams in hushed tones each morning, testing their meaning like omens. Whether they believed or merely pretended to, it gave them something to hold on to. Modern scholars debate how much of this can be trusted. Some suggest the dreams were the product of exhaustion and starvation, the mind compensating for what the body lacked. Others see in them a record of faith's endurance, the imagination keeping the spirit alive where warmth could not. Whatever the reason, these dreams reveal something tender in lives otherwise hardened by war. You picture one soldier now, lying with his back against another for warmth, his breath slow and steady. His eyes flicker behind closed lids. He murmurs something, a name perhaps. In his dream, he might be walking a familiar road lined with trees. He might be seeing a distant cottage, smoke curling from its roof. He might even feel the touch of a warm hand. In the dark, his face softens. For a moment, the lines of hardship disappear. A curious note in a cleric's diary mentions that soldiers often spoke in their sleep, their voices rising and falling like conversation. Some begged forgiveness, others cursed. A few laughed quietly, startling their companions awake. The cleric wondered if such dreams were confessions the body forced from the soul. You can hear those sounds now, drifting from one tent to another. Sighs, fragments of speech, a single quiet chuckle. Not all dreams were solitary. Men who slept close together often shared the same visions, or thought they did. They would wake describing nearly identical scenes: a battle fought under strange stars, a feast interrupted by cold wind, a shadow moving among tents. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps something deeper. Shared fear can make dreams contagious. One account from the Baltic campaigns describes soldiers waking in panic after dreaming that snow had buried their entire camp. When they crawled outside, they found it was true. The storm had come silently, erasing everything but the faint shapes of tents beneath white drifts. Dreams and reality often touched like that, the boundary thin as fabric. The soldiers learned to talk about their dreams in the morning as though they were weather. I dreamed of sunlight, one might say, and another would nod as if that meant something good. The act of sharing turned nightmares into stories, private fears into communal folklore. It made the darkness less personal, the cold more bearable. Experts on medieval psychology sometimes remark that the line between dream and vision was almost non-existent. A soldier might wake certain that he had seen a saint, an ancestor, or even death itself. Chroniclers collected these stories eagerly, proof that divine hands still guided mortal lives. Some men took such visions as signs of protection, others as warnings. Either way, they carried them through the next day's march like invisible armor. There are mentions, too, of the dreams soldiers refused to describe, the ones that made them sit silently at dawn, staring at nothing. One man, in an old Italian manuscript, wrote only, "I saw faces beneath the snow, and they were all looking up." He never explained further. You sit beside a tent and close your eyes, listening. The sound of sleep is not peaceful, but rhythmic. The camp breathes like a single body, rising and falling with each sigh. You can almost feel the dreams moving through it, a current of longing and fear passing from one soul to the next. Somewhere, a horse stamps the ground and snorts, as if sensing something unseen. The noise startles a few men awake. They shift, mutter, then sink back into their shallow dreams. For a moment, you wonder if the horse dreams too of open fields, of green grass, of sunlight. It seems likely. There is a strange tenderness in this landscape of sleepers. Every face, hardened by daylight, softens in rest. Even the most scarred features seem young again, the cold forgotten for a few short hours. In the flicker of a candle, you see hope written in the stillness of their expressions. As you watch, snow begins to fall again, silent and slow. It gathers along the tops of tents, softening every edge, hiding every scar. It looks like peace, though you know it is only temporary. The men sleep on, unaware, their dreams carrying them far from the frost. You think of how fragile these moments are, how the body endures through illusion as much as through strength. Sleep, even uneasy sleep, becomes its own kind of mercy. The night holds its breath. The dreams continue, unseen but alive, like small fires burning quietly in the minds of men. Morning creeps in without sunlight. The grey of dawn is little more than the dark stretched thinner, and for a moment the world feels caught between sleeping and waking. You step through the camp, hearing the soft crack of ice beneath your boots, and notice how different everything looks in this dim light. The tents, the armor, the men themselves, all arranged by rank, by purpose, by invisible lines that divide one life from another. It is well recorded in chronicles that even in the bleakest conditions, order ruled the medieval camp. Rank decided where you slept, what you ate, and even how you froze. Commanders and nobles claimed the driest ground near the center, where the wind broke against their larger tents. Common soldiers slept along the edges, where cold air gathered and frost bit hardest. The pattern resembled the battlefield itself, hierarchy frozen into the landscape. You walk toward the center now, where the tents grow taller and cleaner. Here the smell changes, less sweat and smoke, more oiled leather and fur. Inside these shelters, the officers rest on thick rugs or layered blankets taken from towns long conquered. Their tents hold chests of supplies, sometimes even candles burning through the night. It feels almost warm by comparison. Curiously, letters from attendants reveal that noble tents were often divided by fabric walls, creating separate chambers for sleeping, dressing, and prayer. Some officers even carried folding stools, small tables, or brass bowls for washing. The contrast with the frozen ground outside must have felt unreal. The men who marched beside them saw this comfort and called it sleep for the lucky. Modern historians debate whether such privilege truly mattered in the end. Warmth and softness could not banish hunger or fear. Some chroniclers observed that officers suffered their own kind of cold, the loneliness of command. Still, the difference between a fur-lined blanket and a frozen cloak could decide who woke in the morning. You turn your eyes toward the outskirts of the camp, where the poorest soldiers sleep. The tents there sag under the weight of snow. Inside, men crowd shoulder to shoulder, their bodies curled into knots of shared warmth. Some have no shelter at all, only cloaks stretched across sticks or overturned shields. Their breath rises together in thick clouds that merge into one, blurring the boundaries between them. A curious detail from a Flemish chronicler describes how these low-ranking soldiers used their weapons as tent poles. Spears supported scraps of canvas, and shields formed makeshift doors. The sight must have been strange, a village of war tools turned into homes. The line between defense and survival blurred completely. Researchers continue to discuss how strictly rank controlled space. Some believe it was absolute, reflecting the rigid social order of the time. Others point out that necessity often eroded such distinctions. When storms grew fierce or frost spread too quickly, nobles and commoners alike crowded together under any cover they could find. Cold, after all, respected no title. You pass a small cluster of tents where a knight's pavilion stands beside a row of archers' lean-tos. A servant stirs a pot of thin broth outside, and the smell of it drifts through the air. The knight emerges, wrapped in a fur cloak, and takes a seat on a wooden stool while his men eat crouched on the ground. He looks tired rather than proud. The hierarchy here feels fragile, kept alive more by habit than conviction. In some accounts, commanders were said to share their tents during the harshest nights, not from generosity but from strategy. Keeping trusted men close reduced risk and strengthened loyalty. A warm tent was a currency of its own. You can imagine those quiet conversations in the dark plans whispered between sips of wine, the flicker of candlelight catching on steel. Common soldiers, by contrast, relied on proximity rather than privilege. They slept in groups of 5 or 6, arranged by friendship or chance. Inside each tent, bodies overlapped. Gear was piled near the entrance, and there was barely room to turn. It was cramped, smelly, and yet somehow intimate. Those who survived long winters together formed bonds deeper than any oath sworn in daylight. One fascinating fragment from a chronicler describes how rank could momentarily dissolve during moments of crisis. When blizzards came or supplies ran low, officers might step outside their tents and share food or blankets with the men. Pride gave way to practicality. Then, as the storm passed, structure returned like frost reforming after thaw. You pause near a fire pit buried under snow. The ashes are cold, scattered by wind. Around it lie fragments of burned wood, scraps of fabric, the remains of some earlier attempt at comfort. It looks almost symbolic, the memory of warmth, shared once and forgotten. The air carries faint sounds from every direction, someone sharpening a blade, someone coughing, the low murmur of voices discussing the day's orders. Even here, among exhaustion and cold, discipline persists. A soldier's world is built on rhythm, on doing what must be done before thought has time to protest. You realize that hierarchy in these camps was not merely about authority, but about endurance. The men at the bottom learned patience, the men at the top learned responsibility. Both suffered differently but equally under the same sky. In this shared hardship, the distinctions that filled history books seem thinner than they appear. As daylight strengthens, the camp stirs fully to life. Officers step from their tents, eyes squinting against the glare of snow. Servants fetch water from frozen streams. The lower ranks begin rolling up their bedding, stamping warmth back into stiff limbs. All move with purpose, each role practiced, each gesture part of a fragile order holding chaos at bay. You step back and take in the entire scene. It is beautiful in its bleakness. A hierarchy carved into ice, discipline etched onto every breath. In the distance, the wind rises again, and the banners above the command tents shiver like restless ghosts. Rank will fade, battles will end, but for this morning, structure is survival. You breathe out, your breath joining the mist that hangs above the camp, and feel a quiet respect for these men who carried order into the heart of winter. Even in the coldest darkness, they built their own kind of symmetry. The camp quiets as daylight fades again, but not everyone within it is a soldier. Between the tents, you notice movement that does not belong to marching men or horses. A woman carries a wooden bucket, her shawl pulled tightly against the cold. Behind her, another tends a small child wrapped in rags. Their presence changes the air somehow, softening it. The soldiers glance their way with familiarity, not surprise. You realize now that the story of this camp is not only about the men who fight, but also those who follow. It is well known from records of medieval armies that women and families often traveled with the soldiers. They were not merely companions, but part of the living machinery of war. They cooked, mended clothes, tended the wounded, and sometimes carried supplies when the pack animals failed. The term camp followers does not do justice to their reality. They were the pulse behind the army, the quiet labor that kept it breathing. One surviving list from a 15th century campaign names laundresses, seamstresses, midwives, and cooks among the army's official personnel. Their work did not appear in the stories of glory, yet without them, the soldiers could not have endured even a week of winter. You can almost see them now, women hunched near frozen water, beating stiff cloth against stones, their hands raw and bleeding from cold. A curious mention in an old Burgundian report describes how women built small lean-tos near the men's tents, using scraps of wood and fabric. These spaces were warmer, crowded with laughter and children's chatter. At night, when the camp grew silent, faint lullabies drifted from these shelters, songs meant to quiet babies but heard by weary soldiers too. It must have been strange comfort, the sound of family life surviving among war. Scholars still discuss the moral tension surrounding these camp followers. Some churchmen condemned their presence as sinful, while commanders recognized them as indispensable. In truth, the lines between duty and companionship blurred easily in the cold. A woman might spend the day boiling linen for bandages, and the night sharing warmth with the man whose wounds she dressed. It was not romance in the modern sense, but something more practical and raw, a quiet pact of survival. Inside one of these smaller tents, you see a woman mending a torn cloak by candlelight. The fabric is stiff, the thread uneven, yet her hands move with steady skill. A soldier sleeps beside her, his head resting on his folded arm. She glances at him once, smiles faintly, and continues her work. The air smells faintly of tallow and smoke. You sense that this simple act of repair carries more devotion than any prayer uttered outside. According to letters preserved from a Swiss mercenary, women often shared the men's rations and hardships. They trudged through the same snow, carried water from the same frozen rivers, and sometimes even picked up weapons when danger came too close. Some fought in disguise, their names lost to history. Others stayed behind to tend the sick, their tents turned into makeshift infirmaries. A strange but touching detail from a chronicler of the Wars of the Roses describes soldiers who left small trinkets or coins near the tents of women who had nursed them back to health. These were silent tokens of gratitude, gestures that replaced words. It reminds you that kindness, even in war, finds its own secret ways to speak. There are reports, too, of tensions. Fights broke out over stolen food, jealousy or despair, but for the most part, life within the camp formed its own quiet order. The women created small communities, sharing what little they had, trading scraps of fabric or bits of food, telling stories that reminded everyone of home. The sound of their voices carried warmth that no fire could match. Modern historians often debate whether the presence of women softened the brutality of camp life or simply made survival possible. Some argue that they humanized the men, reminding them of tenderness. Others insist their labor was purely functional, a necessity rather than sentiment. The truth, as always, lies in the middle. It is difficult to imagine any of these men surviving without that daily thread of normalcy woven through the hardship. You pass a tent where a small fire burns low, allowed only because it is hidden beneath a canopy of snow. Around it, three women sit close, their faces illuminated by the soft orange glow. One hums a tune while sewing, another rocks a child. The third peels what looks like a turnip with a dull knife. Their breath clouds in the air, mingling with the faint smoke. For a brief moment, the space feels like a home. A record from a priest accompanying an army in France mentions that he envied these scenes. He wrote that, "Where men sleep for death, women still make life." You understand him now. The warmth that fills this small circle of light is not from the fire, but from routine, from care performed in repetition. It is the same instinct that has kept humanity alive in every century. As night settles fully, the women retreat into their shelters. The soldiers nearby sleep more soundly tonight, comforted by the soft noises that replace the wind's howl, the rustle of fabric, the faint laughter of a child. The camp becomes a strange mixture of battlefield and village, war and life intertwined. You step away, the image lingering behind your eyes, a woman sewing by candlelight, her needle flashing like a star. Around her, the world is frozen and cruel, yet she moves with calm purpose, each stitch an act of resistance. You realize that in this frozen camp, she is the truest warmth of all. The next morning begins in a hush that feels heavier than usual. The wind has dropped, but the cold has deepened. Every movement seems slower, as though the air itself resists motion. Men stir stiffly, wincing as they stretch limbs that ache with old bruises and new frostbite. The smell of damp wool and smoke has become part of them now. But something sharper lingers today, a faint metallic scent of pain. It is well recorded in military journals and monastery notes that winter sickness claimed nearly as many lives as the sword. Frostbite, fever, infection, and exhaustion crept silently through the camp. Healers worked with little more than faith and improvisation, combining prayer with crude treatments. You walk past one of their makeshift shelters now, a tent marked by strips of cloth tied to its poles. Inside, the moans are low and rhythmic, as if pain itself has become part of the weather. Contemporary records describe a handful of remedies that sound miraculous or absurd, depending on how you see them. For frostbite, men rubbed their hands with snow, believing cold cured cold. For fever, they drank wine steeped with herbs or pressed hot stones against the chest. Honey was prized for wounds when it could be spared, and animal fat served as a balm against cracked skin. It was a fragile balance of wisdom and desperation. One particularly vivid account from a Venetian doctor mentions soldiers wrapping frozen fingers in rags soaked with their own urine, convinced the warmth would restore blood flow. The method disgusted observers but sometimes worked. Another wrote of men who stuffed their boots with moss soaked in vinegar to ward off infection. You almost smile at the strange ingenuity born of necessity, the quiet stubbornness of bodies refusing to surrender. Scholars remain divided over how effective these early treatments were. Some argue that luck mattered more than medicine, that recovery depended on youth and endurance. Others suggest that even crude hygiene and herbal salves prevented greater suffering. What none dispute is that medieval camps reeked of illness. You can smell it now, the sour odor of sweat, rot, and unwashed fabric mixed with the faint sweetness of herbs. Inside one tent, a woman wipes the brow of a wounded soldier. His face is pale, lips blue around the edges. The candlelight flickers across his armor piled nearby. Useless now. The woman dips a cloth into warm water, though the steam barely rises in the cold. She presses it gently to his forehead, whispering something too soft to hear. It is not medicine, but it is care. Sometimes that was all they had. According to the writings of Brother Armand, a monk who followed French troops, soldiers believed certain metals carried healing power. Iron, they thought, drew out sickness. Bronze protected against fever. Many slept with their daggers beside them, not for defense but for health. Some tied bits of iron to their wrists or ankles. Others placed coins under their tongues to warm the blood. The faith in these charms blurred the line between superstition and treatment. There are accounts, too, of commanders hiring wandering healers who mixed science and mysticism in equal measure. These men and women carried pouches of herbs, bottles of oils, and relics they swore could cure anything. Some muttered prayers as they worked. Others recited fragments of forgotten languages. A few were frauds, but others left behind records of surprising success. Garlic poultices for wounds, willow bark for pain, mead to clean the mouth, all ancient wisdom disguised as magic. Curiously, soldiers often distrusted doctors but trusted nurses. Care from a familiar face, even one untrained, seemed safer than the hands of a stranger wielding knives. You picture a young archer refusing the surgeon's blade, letting a comrade pour hot wine over a gash instead. The scream is brief, the relief slower. The body endures because it must. Archaeologists studying old encampments have found traces of ash mixed with bone and herbs near fire pits, remnants of salves prepared on cold nights. Some ingredients, like sage and juniper, have real antibacterial qualities. Others, such as powdered horn or dried blood, belong more to the realm of faith than fact. It seems the line between knowledge and belief was as thin as the canvas that shielded them. You imagine how it must have felt to fall ill here, to shiver in a tent where even breath turned to frost. Fever would bring strange visions. Pain might sound like a distant drumbeat. Those who survived spoke of dreams filled with warmth, as if the mind itself tried to create what the world had stolen. There is a small sound beside you now, a cough, wet and heavy. A soldier sits wrapped in his cloak, his skin pale beneath the grime. Another hands him a flask of wine, muttering encouragement. No one asks whether he will recover. Questions like that have no meaning here. They focus instead on what can be done now. A sip of warmth, a shared blanket, a few words. In a rare letter from a Hungarian knight, he wrote that sickness in the camp taught us gentleness. He meant that suffering stripped away pride. Rank disappeared when the body failed. A lord could beg a peasant for water. A healer could command a captain to lie still. Pain made equals of them all. Experts today point out that these improvised acts of care were as much social medicine as physical. Compassion slowed despair, which often proved more deadly than wounds. You can see that truth here, in the quiet patience with which they tend one another. As night approaches, the sick drift into uneasy sleep. Some murmur prayers, others sigh softly, their breaths mingling in the cold. A faint smell of burning herbs seeps from the tent, sage and smoke mingling with the frost. Outside, snow falls again, covering everything in silence. You stand there for a long moment, watching the flicker of candlelight behind the canvas, the shadows moving like fragile spirits. It strikes you that survival, in a place like this, is not only a matter of strength but of shared endurance. Every act of care, no matter how small, is an act of rebellion against the cold. You breathe deeply, and the air stings your lungs, filled with both life and decay. Somewhere behind you, a soft voice begins to hum a tune, low and steady. Perhaps it is a prayer, perhaps a lullaby. Either way, it sounds like healing. The sound of wind is constant now, a low moan that seems to come from the earth itself. The men are packing their belongings, faces drawn tight with fatigue. They have stayed too long in one place, and the order has come to move. You can feel the unease running through the camp like a current. No one likes marching in winter, but the frozen landscape leaves no choice. The road ahead stretches white and endless. Contemporary accounts describe these winter marches as the hardest part of a campaign. Sleep became a luxury, warmth a memory. Soldiers trudged through snow that swallowed their boots, their armor stiff with ice. The pace was slow, the danger constant. Each step could mean sinking into a drift or slipping on unseen frost. You can hear it now, the crunch of snow under hundreds of feet, the groan of wagons stuck in mud turned to stone. According to several medieval journals, armies often broke camp before dawn to make use of the limited daylight. The soldiers moved in silence, breath rising in small clouds. Horses struggled forward, snorting steam. The wheels of carts creaked, their rims frozen hard as iron. Behind them, the camp they had just left vanished beneath new snow, as if it had never existed. A curious detail appears in a letter written by a knight from Burgundy. He described how men tied cloth or straw around their boots to keep the snow from cutting into their legs. It worked for a few hours before freezing solid. When they stopped to rest, they had to break the ice away with knives. The letter ends with a single line. The ground itself fights us. You can almost feel that resistance beneath your own feet. Scholars have long debated how far soldiers could march in such conditions. Some claim 15 miles a day, others half that. The truth likely shifted with terrain, morale, and hunger. The body grows slower when sleep is only a rumor. Still, they kept moving, drawn forward by duty, fear, and the promise of anything warmer ahead. There is a strange rhythm to these marches. The men walk in long lines, each following the footprints of the one before. The snow muffles sound, so the only noise is breathing, the soft thud of steps, and the occasional jingle of chainmail. You look around and realize that everyone is enclosed in their own silence, thoughts locked away behind numb faces. One report from the Baltic campaigns describes how men fell asleep while walking. Their bodies kept moving even as their minds drifted away. Some stumbled into ditches or fell beneath carts before anyone noticed. Companions would shake them awake, curse them, and pull them back into line. The body obeys habit even when the mind has given up. It is recorded that commanders tried to keep spirits high with songs or prayers shouted along the march. The words froze in the air, carried away by wind. Still, the noise reminded the men that they were not alone. You can hear that faint chorus now, scattered and uneven, echoing across the fields like a memory of warmth. A peculiar account from an English chronicler tells of soldiers spreading their cloaks over their shoulders and walking backward during blizzards to shield their faces. The idea sounds foolish, yet it worked. Vision mattered less than endurance. When the storm grew too fierce, they formed tight groups, pressing together like migrating birds, sharing heat as they moved. Experts continue to discuss how such marches affected survival. Some suggest constant motion kept frostbite away, while others argue that exhaustion made men collapse faster. Both are true in different moments. The trick was knowing when to move and when to stop. Too long in one place meant freezing. Too long on the road meant collapse. Each decision balanced between peril and necessity. You imagine the scene now. Hundreds of soldiers crossing an empty plain, the world white in every direction. The sun, when it appears, glows pale and weak. The air tastes of metal. Ahead, a banner flutters weakly, its colors faded by frost. Behind it trail men who look more like shadows than soldiers, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their breath the only proof of life. Occasionally they stop, crouching to rest. Some sit in the snow, staring blankly ahead. Others stamp their feet to keep blood moving. A few close their eyes for moments that feel too long. A captain shouts to rise again, and the line moves forward. It feels less like marching and more like drifting, the whole army carried forward by inertia and stubbornness. One chronicler from the Teutonic campaigns wrote that the sound of an army marching through snow was like 1,000 hearts beating beneath the earth. It is an image both eerie and beautiful. You listen now, and you can almost hear that heartbeat, slow and relentless, pulsing through the frozen ground. Occasionally, a figure stumbles out of line. Companions stop, drag him back to his feet, mutter curses that sound more like blessings. No one can afford to fall behind. The cold swallows those who do. In the distance, the horizon disappears into white. There is no difference between sky and ground now, only movement through nothingness. Yet amid all this hardship, there are small miracles. A man pulls a piece of bread from his coat, still soft because he kept it near his chest. Another finds a frozen apple at the bottom of his pack and shares it with two others. Laughter breaks the silence for a moment, short but real. Even in the harshest cold, the spark of humanity refuses to die. When the army finally stops for the night, tents rise again on the hardened earth. There will be no fire, only cloaks and the faint glow of shared breath. But for now, they have moved forward, and that, in its own way, is victory. You look at their faces in the dim light, eyes hollow but alive. They have outlasted the day. The frost will take others, the hunger will test more, but for this moment, they are still moving, still human. And tomorrow, when the wind starts again, they will rise and march once more. By evening, the soldiers reach higher ground, where the snow lies thinner and the trees stand like black spears against the pale sky. The march has ended for now. The commander's signal echoes across the ridge, and the men begin to set camp again. This time, though, the pattern is different. The tents rise beside old stone walls and half-collapsed roofs. You recognize the outlines of a ruined village, its timbers frozen into strange, crooked shapes. It is known from many campaign diaries that winter sometimes forced armies to settle in what they called fortified quarters. These were not castles in the romantic sense, but whatever shelter could be held or repaired: a barn, a monastery, an abandoned manor, even the remains of a burned hamlet. Inside such walls, soldiers could finally rest without the constant fear of exposure. According to an account from a Burgundian officer, men rushed to claim corners of any structure that still had a roof. The lucky ones found straw or leftover furniture to burn. Others tore down doors and fences for wood, laughing as the warmth filled their hands again. The laughter was rough and desperate, but it carried a music all its own. A curious note from an Italian chronicler describes the way these makeshift garrisons looked from a distance: half ruin, half fortress. Tattered banners hung beside church bells, armor leaned against altars, and straw-covered floors that had once been stone. The line between sanctuary and survival blurred completely. Inside one such building, you see soldiers dragging in hay bales and old planks. The smell of dust rises, dry and ancient, a change from the frozen air outside. They work quickly, speaking little. You can tell they have done this before. They spread the straw, patch holes in the walls with cloth, and block the broken windows with shields. Within an hour, the space begins to feel alive again. A letter from a northern knight records that officers often took over the largest structures while their men slept in barns or cellars. The hierarchy of the open camp followed them indoors. Yet the difference mattered less here. Everyone could feel the walls keeping out the wind. The sound of the storm became distant, muffled by stone. Scholars still discuss how long armies could remain in such quarters. Some stayed only a few nights before moving on, while others lingered for months, turning villages into temporary towns. Soldiers repaired roofs, hunted nearby forests, even planted small gardens when the thaw came early. The war paused, but life continued in quieter rhythms. You imagine one of these nights now. A group of men sits near a fire built carefully within an old hearth. The flames throw their shadows against cracked walls. A few dice roll across the floor, their clatter sharp in the stillness. Someone hums, another sharpens a knife, and for the first time in weeks the air feels almost human. There are reports from monastic chronicles describing how soldiers shared space with monks during such winters. The two groups made uneasy companions, one devoted to war, the other to peace. Yet both understood hardship. The monks offered bread and ale. The soldiers offered protection. In some cases, friendships formed that lasted long after the war ended. A strange but telling detail appears in the writings of a French abbey. The brothers complained that soldiers dried their wet clothes on the same altars where candles burned, filling the church with the smell of smoke and sweat. Still, they admitted that when the men left, the silence felt emptier. Even war brought warmth in its own crude way. Modern historians argue about how these fortified camps changed the course of campaigns. Some claim they preserved armies that might otherwise have perished. Others believe they prolonged wars by giving soldiers enough strength to fight again in spring. Whatever their effect on history, they reveal how adaptable the human spirit can be. You look around one of these shelters now and notice the small touches that turn ruin into home. Someone has carved initials into a beam. Another has hung a piece of coloured cloth from a spear tip, a scrap of beauty in the dark. A child, perhaps one of the camp followers, sleeps beside her mother in a corner, wrapped in a cloak that once belonged to a fallen soldier. The night outside grows colder, but inside the walls, the fire crackles softly. The soldiers share dried meat, breaking it with knives and hands. One pours the last of his wine into a cup and passes it around. They speak of nothing important: stories of foolish commanders, memories of warm summers, jokes about frozen boots. Their laughter fills the space, and for a while the war feels distant. A chronicler who lived through one such winter wrote that stone remembers warmth. He meant that every fire lit in an old ruin leaves its trace in the walls. You can feel it too, the faint echo of comfort spreading through the stones around you. The storm outside rages against the roof, but the building holds steady. In the far corner, a soldier kneels before a broken statue of a saint. The head is missing, the hands cracked, but he prays quietly all the same. His words are lost in the sound of the fire, yet you sense what he asks for: another sunrise, another breath, another night like this one when the cold stays outside. When you step back into the courtyard, snow drifts in slow circles, falling through the gaps in the roof. The air smells of smoke and straw, a reminder that even ruin can hold life. The men inside will sleep soundly tonight, their dreams lighter under solid walls. For a moment, you stand in the middle of the frozen village and listen. The wind hums through empty windows, but beneath it, faintly, comes the low murmur of voices and the crackle of fire. It is the sound of endurance, of fragile warmth carved out of desolation. You breathe it in, and the cold feels less cruel. Outside the walls of the fortified camp, the world is quiet, but not peaceful. In the distance stands a city under siege, its towers dark against the pale sky. You can feel tension in the air, the kind that presses against the chest and makes each breath feel heavier. The soldiers here are not resting in safety. They are waiting, watching, preparing to hold their ground through another night without fire. Accounts from the chronicles of many sieges tell the same story. Winter turned both attacker and defender into prisoners of the cold. Fires were dangerous. For those besieging a fortress, even a wisp of smoke could betray a position to archers on the walls. For those trapped inside, firewood was scarce and precious, often rationed by the handful. It was a season not of battles but of endurance, a slow contest of who could survive the frost longer. You walk along the siege lines now, where the snow lies churned and grey. The air smells faintly of iron and mud. Men crouch behind crude barriers of timber and stone, their faces half hidden by scarves. Their armor gleams faintly with frost, each breath forming a small cloud that vanishes into the mist. A few whisper to one another, voices low and measured, as if speech itself could summon arrows. According to one eyewitness from the siege of Tournai, soldiers dug small pits to sleep in, covering them with boards and dirt. Inside, the earth trapped a faint trace of body heat. It was dark, damp, and claustrophobic, but better than freezing in the open. He wrote that the trick was to lie still and let the warmth build slowly, breathing shallow to conserve air. You can imagine that strange half-life underground, men cocooned in the soil like seeds waiting for spring. Another chronicler describes how siege armies relied on animal carcasses for heat. Horses too weak to stand were killed, their hides used for blankets, their flesh boiled into thin stew. The smell of it clung to everything: the tents, the clothes, even the snow. It was a grim comfort, yet one the soldiers accepted without hesitation. A curious story survives from a German campaign. A group of soldiers, unable to risk fire, filled their helmets with coals during daylight and buried them in earth to keep them warm. At night, they dug them up and held them close, the faint heat glowing like hope itself. The practice was dangerous, sometimes burning the hands that held them, but warmth was worth the risk. Modern scholars discuss how often these desperate methods worked. Some claim the men learned to live at the edge of frostbite, their bodies hardened by repetition. Others argue that many simply froze quietly, their deaths unrecorded, their names lost beneath snow. Yet even silence speaks, and the presence of these crude shelters and pits across Europe testifies to lives lived at the brink. You walk closer to the city walls now. They rise like cliffs from the snow, covered in ice that glitters faintly in the moonlight. The defenders' fires glow weakly through arrow slits, tiny dots of amber in the dark. You realize how strange it must have been for both sides to see warmth so close and yet unreachable, to smell smoke but not feel its heat. Inside the besieged towns, conditions were no better. Chroniclers tell of people burning furniture, doors, even icons to keep from freezing. Bread was rationed, water frozen solid in wells. Those who survived wrote of nights so cold that the sound of breaking ice echoed through empty streets like footsteps. You can almost hear it now, a brittle rhythm carried by wind. According to letters from a French garrison commander, soldiers slept in shifts to conserve fuel. One half of the group would stand watch while the other huddled together, using the heat of their bodies instead of fire. He called it the turning of the warmth. Every 2 hours they traded places, the sleepers rising to give their heat back to the newly cold. It was a grim choreography of survival, performed without music or pause. There are stories of strange alliances forming during sieges in winter. Enemies sometimes agreed to temporary truces to bury the dead or exchange food. Once, during a storm, attackers and defenders both ceased fighting for 3 days, each hidden behind snow, each too frozen to hate the other. When the sky cleared, they resumed as if nothing had happened. A monk who witnessed such a siege wrote that the cold became God's peace. He meant that frost forced men to remember their shared weakness. You think of that now, watching soldiers from one camp gaze across at the faint fires of their foes. They do not shout, they do not fight. They simply watch the same snow fall between them. Some historians still debate whether winter truly favored attackers or defenders. Some say the walls gave shelter, others that the open fields provided freedom to move. What seems clear is that the season cared for neither side. The cold was an equal ruler. You turn your gaze to the horizon, where the siege lines vanish into mist. The camp behind you sleeps in scattered fragments, men curled in holes, wrapped in cloaks stiff with frost, faces hidden against the dark. Their dreams, if they come, will be short and shallow. In the city ahead, the defenders lie awake, counting the same hours, watching the same stars. It occurs to you that this war within winter is not fought with weapons but with breath. Every exhale is a tiny victory, proof of life against the weight of silence. The wind rises suddenly, carrying the faint groan of the frozen ropes and the clink of distant armor. You close your eyes and listen. The siege continues, not in shouts or drums, but in the sound of men refusing to surrender to the night. The snow begins again, soft and steady. It blurs the boundary between camp and city, between soldier and enemy, between life and memory. For this one moment, the world holds still, suspended in the slow rhythm of survival. By the time midnight falls, the siege lines are buried again in silence. The snow absorbs every sound, softening the edges of the world until nothing feels solid. You step through the camp and notice how quiet it has become. No laughter, no arguments, not even the creak of armor, only the faint rhythm of breathing and the soft hiss of wind across the drifts. The world has been swallowed by stillness. Writers from the period often spoke about this kind of silence as if it were alive. It frightened men more than any noise of battle. One chronicler from Burgundy called it the silence that listens. He believed that in such moments, even thought seemed to echo too loudly inside the skull. It is easy to understand him. You can hear your own heart beating here, heavy and deliberate, a reminder that sound itself becomes fragile in cold. According to the notes of a French scribe who travelled with the army, the quietest nights came when snow fell without wind. Each flake softened the air until even footsteps disappeared. He described standing watch and realizing that he could no longer hear his own movement. It was like walking inside a dream. You can almost feel that same sensation now. The strange piece of sound erased, a world where even breath becomes uncertain. A curious entry in a monk's journal compares winter silence to prayer. He wrote that the cold teaches humility, for it makes every man whisper. His words linger with you as you look around. The camp feels like a cathedral without walls. The soldiers, its silent congregation. No one speaks, yet the shared stillness feels like devotion. Modern historians have tried to imagine how this soundlessness affected morale. Some think it calmed the men, giving them brief moments of reflection. Others argue it made fear worse, the absence of sound amplifying every small noise that did occur. A twig snapping could sound like thunder, a horse's breath like the approach of ghosts. You feel that tension now, the awareness that quiet can be both comfort and threat. You walk past a group of sentries standing along the perimeter. They do not talk. Their spears are planted in the snow, their faces half covered with cloth. One man shifts slightly, his armor giving the faintest metallic sigh. The others glance toward him instinctively. In this kind of silence, every sound carries weight. According to one chronicler from the Baltic campaigns, soldiers would sometimes whisper or hum softly just to remind themselves they were not alone. The habit began as superstition but became a kind of ritual. Some even claimed that humming warmed the chest, a small spark of heat created by the vibration of their own voices. Perhaps it did. You hear it now, faint and steady, the low tune of a man trying to hold the dark at bay. Another account describes how silence in the snow could play tricks on the mind. Distance vanished. A man might hear what seemed like a voice or a step, only to find nothing there. Some believed spirits wandered the fields on such nights. Others blamed exhaustion. Either way, silence made imagination louder. There is something haunting about how still the camp feels now. Even the horses are quiet, their breath rising in slow streams that vanish before reaching the stars. The snow glows faintly, reflecting the moon, and for a moment you think you can see movement in the distance. Then you realize it is only the shifting of light, the world breathing through frost. A traveler's record from the late 14th century describes standing outside a winter camp and hearing nothing at all, not the wind, not the men, not even the fire. He wrote that it felt like being suspended between life and death, caught in a moment that refused to move forward. You understand him. This kind of silence feels eternal, like the world itself is holding its breath. Some experts argue that this silence may have offered soldiers rare peace. Without sound, there was no need for words or orders, no reminder of command or chaos. The body rested even when the mind could not. But others note how easily such quiet could break a person. Too much stillness becomes a mirror, forcing men to listen to their own thoughts, to hear fear whispering where no enemy stands. You pause in the middle of the camp and close your eyes. The stillness presses close, heavy and cold. For a moment, you imagine that you are alone in the world, surrounded only by air and memory. Then a small sound breaks through the creak of leather, the soft sigh of a man turning in his sleep. It is barely audible, but it feels enormous, like a bell in the distance. The silence reshapes itself around it, and life returns to the camp. The snow continues to fall, thick and patient. It covers the footprints you made minutes ago, erasing every trace of movement. The tents become rounded mounds of white. From somewhere far off, a single crow calls once and is answered by nothing. The world goes still again. You realize that this silence is not absence but presence. It holds everything within it: the fatigue, the hope, the dreams of men who will rise again tomorrow to the same struggle. You breathe deeply, and the sound of that breath feels sacred. The camp sleeps, and the night keeps watch, its quiet as vast and unbroken as history itself. The snow that brought silence also brought other guests. You notice it first in the way the men scratch absently at their sleeves, then at the constant flick of fingers inside collars. The truth is simple and unpleasant. They are never alone in their sleep. Every fold of fabric, every layer of straw, carries life of its own. It is written in countless reports that winter camps crawled with small invaders. Lice, fleas, and rats followed armies as faithfully as banners. The cold slowed them, but never stopped them. Soldiers learned to live with the constant itch, the soft rustle in the night, the tiny movements just out of sight. The battle against the cold was only half the struggle. The other was against what the cold failed to kill. According to one chronicler from the German states, lice were so common that soldiers joked about naming them. They called them camp friends and flicked them into the fire during the day, watching them pop with grim satisfaction. You can almost hear the crackle of that small private war beside every tent. A curious note in an English soldier's diary describes how men tried to fight the pests with vinegar or ashes. They rubbed their skin raw with handfuls of straw, believing it would scrape the insects away. It helped little. The lice returned within hours, hidden deep in seams and stitches. The scratching became a kind of music, constant and rhythmic, a sound that filled the quiet nights when no one dared speak too loudly. Experts still argue how severe infestations truly were. Some say they were universal, that no soldier ever escaped. Others think certain armies fared better with stricter hygiene, though water was frozen more often than flowing. Whatever the truth, every man who lived through a medieval winter learned the feel of something crawling on his skin. The fleas were worse in the straw beds. Chroniclers describe how soldiers could not sleep without shaking out their bedding first, though the result was only a moment's relief. Fleas thrived in the warmth of shared bodies, breeding in the very materials meant to bring comfort. When one man scratched, the others soon followed, laughter breaking out in the dark at the absurdity of it all. Then there were the rats. Their presence was impossible to ignore. They scuttled between tents, drawn by food scraps, gnawing at packs and boots. In many accounts, soldiers came to see them as part of the company, a nuisance but also a sign that life remained. The rats moved where the men moved. They ate what the men ate. Some soldiers fed them crumbs, claiming it brought luck. A strange anecdote from a Flemish camp describes soldiers setting traps not to kill rats but to catch them for warmth. They tucked the captured creatures into pouches and let them sleep there, their small bodies radiating heat. It sounds grotesque, yet desperate times made desperate comforts. According to monastic observers, the presence of these creatures troubled priests deeply. They saw in them symbols of sin, reminders that filth and punishment walked together. They urged commanders to enforce cleanliness, to wash clothes and scrub tents. The soldiers listened politely and continued scratching. Water was too precious to waste on purity. Archaeologists studying old campsites have found bones and gnawed bits of wood near sleeping areas. The marks tell stories of quiet companionship, of men and animals bound together by need. Some graves even contain the remains of rats beside human bones, buried by accident or perhaps by strange affection. You step closer to one tent now, and hear faint movement beneath the canvas. Inside, a man sits upright, muttering curses as he shakes his cloak. Tiny black dots scatter across the straw. His companion laughs tiredly, saying, "They eat better than we do." The two settle back, still chuckling, the laughter half surrender and half defiance. In letters home, soldiers often mentioned the endless itching with a kind of weary humour. They spoke of it as one might speak of the weather, unpleasant but expected. A few wrote that they missed the fleas when they returned home, the silence of clean sheets too strange to bear. It is difficult to imagine, yet after months in the field, even discomfort could become familiar enough to feel like company. Some historians believe this constant irritation hardened the men's minds. When your body never stops itching, fear feels less important. Pain becomes another rhythm, one you learn to live with. Others argue that it wore them down, draining patience and sleep until tempers cracked. You can see both truths reflected here, in the tired faces and small acts of endurance that fill the camp. The horses are not spared either. Fleas and lice crawl beneath their thick winter coats, and the soldiers brush them more out of sympathy than hope. The sound of coarse hair rasping under stiff brushes mixes with the murmurs of conversation. It is a strangely intimate noise, the kind that belongs more to barns than battlefields. You realize that these infestations, revolting as they seem, bind the camp together in an odd way. Everyone suffers equally, regardless of rank. The commander scratches just as the peasant does. For a few moments each night, pride dissolves into the shared discomfort of flesh. The night grows colder, yet inside the tents, the men continue their small rituals. They pick at seams, flick insects into the dark, murmur jokes about their unwelcome guests. The scratching never stops completely. It becomes a background rhythm, a reminder that even in stillness, life moves on. When you finally step back into the open air, the quiet outside feels startling. The stars above glitter like frost. The world looks peaceful again, though you know that under every blanket, under every patch of straw, tiny movements persist. You smile at the thought, not in mockery, but in awe. Even in a world this frozen, something always survives. The night feels heavy again, the sky swollen with clouds that promise more snow. The soldiers are quieter than usual, speaking little as they repair their gear and settle in. You can sense a kind of still endurance in the air, a silence that feels both patient and weary. At moments like this, faith becomes the only warmth that does not fade. Records from every corner of medieval Europe reveal how deeply religion wove itself into army life. To march without prayer was to invite disaster. Even the most hardened mercenary carried some token of belief: a small wooden cross, a relic wrapped in cloth, or a saint's name whispered like a charm. In the frozen dark, these symbols became more than reminders. They were proof that something beyond the cold still cared whether a man lived or died. According to the journal of a Cistercian monk who followed the armies in Burgundy, priests moved through the camp before nightfall, offering blessings. The men bowed their heads, not always from piety but from habit. He wrote that the prayers hung in the air like smoke, fragile but unwilling to fade. You can imagine those words echoing among the tents, mingling with the sound of armor settling into the snow. A curious report from the Crusades describes how soldiers drew crosses in the frost before lying down to sleep. The marks melted quickly from their breath, yet they repeated the act every night. Some scratched small signs into their shields, believing the symbol would keep demons from entering their dreams. The gesture was simple, but it offered comfort in a world that rarely did. Modern historians continue to study how faith sustained soldiers through such conditions. Some argue that it gave meaning to suffering, transforming hardship into divine testing. Others believe it acted as a psychological shield, something that made fear easier to bear. Either way, prayer filled the gaps that no fire could reach. You walk through the camp and hear fragments of devotion everywhere. One man kneels beside his tent, whispering into cupped hands. Another presses his lips to a medal hanging from his neck. A group gathers near the horses, reciting the Lord's Prayer in low voices. Their breath rises together in the cold, forming clouds that glow faintly under the moonlight. Yet faith here is not all solemnity. Laughter follows the prayers, and teasing too. A soldier jokes that his charm works better than his sword, another that the saints must be frozen solid by now. The humor is gentle, born not of mockery, but of familiarity. They know that jesting at faith is safer than losing it altogether. One chronicler tells of a night when an unexpected thaw brought mud instead of snow. The soldiers slipped, cursed, and laughed until someone declared it a miracle from St. Martin. They all cheered, half in jest, half in gratitude. Faith in winter was not about theology but about survival of the spirit. There are also stories of doubt. Some soldiers refused to pray, claiming God had forgotten them. Others sought comfort in superstition instead. They tossed small stones into the snow for luck, whispered to the wind before sleep, or spoke to the stars as if they were old friends. Even disbelief carried its rituals. A letter from a squire to his brother speaks of the strange mix of hope and resignation that filled these nights. "We are taught that the cold purifies," he wrote, "but I think it only makes us honest." He meant that hardship stripped men of false words, leaving only what they truly believed. You can feel that same honesty in the air now, raw and unpolished. According to one French priest's account, soldiers often confessed their sins before dawn, fearing death in the day's march. The priest described listening to them speak through chattering teeth, voices trembling not from guilt but from cold. He absolved them quickly, promising warmth in heaven, if not on earth. The words were small comfort, yet the men seemed lighter afterward. Some historians point out that faith in the camp was not always unified. Different regions brought different saints and customs. An Englishman might pray to St. George, while a Spaniard called upon St. James. Sometimes arguments broke out over whose patron was stronger, ending in laughter rather than violence. The diversity of belief became another thread in the fabric of survival. You pause near a group of men sitting around a lantern shielded from the wind. One of them hums a hymn, his voice rough but steady. The melody drifts softly, wrapping the circle in calm. Even those who do not know the words listen in silence. When he finishes, no one speaks for a long time. The stillness feels sacred. In an old parchment from a monastery near Mainz, a scribe wrote that soldiers learned to see warmth in the cross itself. He was not speaking metaphorically. Many soldiers carried crucifixes close to their skin, the metal warmed by their bodies. To touch it was to feel both their own heartbeat and the symbol of endurance. The same gesture repeats here now, invisible in the dark but deeply known. You look up, and the clouds have parted. A handful of stars shine through, pale and distant. A soldier beside you notices too and mutters that heaven must be cold tonight. You almost smile at his remark. Faith, you think, is not always found in sermons. Sometimes it is hidden in quiet humor, in the stubborn will to speak at all when the world itself has gone silent. The camp begins to settle again. The prayers fade, replaced by the slow rhythm of breathing. Somewhere in the dark, a man still hums his hymn, barely audible now. The sound mingles with the wind until it becomes part of the night itself. You close your eyes, warmed not by heat but by the quiet certainty that belief, in all its fragile forms, has kept the fire of endurance alive. By the next morning the sky turns a flat, empty white, and the camp moves slowly, as if time itself has frozen. The soldiers rise stiffly, rubbing their faces with handfuls of snow to wake themselves. The sound of movement is dull and muted, the crunch of boots sinking into drifts, the slow clink of armor being buckled once again. Everything they wear feels heavier than it should. It is described in many accounts that winter clothing for soldiers was both blessing and burden. They wrapped themselves in layer after layer, tunics of wool, cloaks of rough cloth, scraps of fur or leather, tied around neck and wrists. These layers trapped warmth but also trapped moisture. Within hours the sweat from marching turned to ice. The soldiers called it the weight of living. You can see why. According to an inventory from a 15th century Burgundian army, each man carried 2 woolen garments and a cloak if he was lucky. The wealthy added fur lining or quilted padding. Common soldiers scavenged whatever they could: horse blankets, torn banners, even old tent fabric stitched into makeshift coats. They wore their survival on their backs, pieced together from anything that held heat. A curious entry in a mercenary's diary mentions that men stuffed dry grass or straw inside their tunics for insulation. It rustled with every step, but the noise meant life. Some soldiers joked that they could be heard coming long before they were seen, their bodies whispering like haystacks. The laughter was thin, but it helped them forget the stiffness in their limbs. Scholars still debate how effective such improvised clothing really was. Some argue that the layers of natural fibers worked well, creating air pockets that held warmth. Others note that dampness ruined everything. Once the wool soaked through, it clung to the skin and drew heat away. Either way, these men had no other choice. They wrapped themselves in the world they carried. The hands suffered most. Gloves were rare, so soldiers tied bits of cloth around their fingers or wore strips of fur taken from animals they hunted. Some dipped their hands in wax to seal the cracks in their skin, a trick learned from cobblers and candle makers. The smell of tallow followed them everywhere, greasy and comforting in its own way. A fascinating note from an English archer's record describes how he rubbed a mixture of ashes and oil on his palms before sleep to keep them supple. The trick, he claimed, came from a Moorish prisoner. Whether true or not, the idea spread quickly. Across camps, men shared recipes for warmth, the way others traded stories or dice. The face was harder to protect. The wind burned like a blade, and exposed skin turned white within minutes. Some soldiers smeared animal fat on their cheeks and noses, forming a greasy shield against frostbite. Others wrapped linen around their heads until only the eyes remained visible. Looking across the camp now, you see figures that seem almost faceless, eyes gleaming through folds of cloth, human yet distant. According to the letters of a French squire, the worst moments came when clothing froze stiff overnight. He wrote of waking to find his cloak standing upright beside him, hard as wood. To put it on meant wrestling with ice, cracking it at the seams. The sound, he said, was like breaking bones. You can almost hear it now, the brittle snap of frozen fabric echoing through the still air. When the wind howled too fiercely, soldiers turned their cloaks into small shelters. They staked the corners to the ground and crawled inside, curling into balls to trap the last warmth of the day. The sight of hundreds of men cocooned like that must have been strange, the field covered in shapeless bundles that breathed. Modern historians point out that some armies learned from shepherds and travellers in the highlands. They wore cloaks treated with oil to repel water, or carried spare cloths wrapped tightly in waxed leather. It was crude technology, but surprisingly effective. A dry layer could save a life. Still, no garment could defeat exhaustion. Clothes became part of the body, never removed, never fully clean. The smell of sweat and smoke grew so thick it felt permanent. Soldiers joked that the odor frightened wolves away. Perhaps it did. You watch one man now as he adjusts his layers. His tunic hangs in tatters, the wool frayed at the edges. He pulls it tighter anyway, then ties a strip of linen around his neck. Another soldier nearby offers him a patch of fur cut from a dead animal. They share a small smile, the kind that asks nothing and gives everything. A letter from a Bohemian footman says, "We wrap ourselves in what the world leaves behind." It is a sentence that stays with you. You picture these men clothed in the remnants of everything: fabric from villages burned, fur from fallen beasts, patches sewn from banners that once flew above battles now forgotten. Their clothing becomes a history of survival stitched together by need. As the day darkens, the men settle again. They kneel to shake the snow from their cloaks, beating them against their knees. The sound rises in rhythm, a chorus of dull thuds that echoes across the frozen field. Then, the quiet returns. You realize that every fold of fabric here tells a story of resilience. Each torn edge and crooked seam marks a moment when someone refused to surrender to the cold. The clothes may be crude, but they are a kind of armor, protecting not just the flesh but the will. When the wind picks up again, the soldiers pull their cloaks tight, hoods drawn low. They huddle close, their shapes blending into one another until they seem like a single creature, ancient and enduring, wrapped in the memory of warmth. The next night brings fog instead of snow. It settles low over the camp, thick enough to hide even the nearest tent. The air tastes faintly of metal, damp and strange, and every breath feels heavier than the one before. Visibility shrinks until the world exists only within arm's reach. It feels like the earth itself has decided to exhale. Many soldiers of the Middle Ages wrote about nights like this. They called the fog the walking mist, and feared it more than darkness. The cold air soaked through their clothes and dulled their senses, blurring friend and enemy alike. It silenced the camp in a way even snow could not. No sound carried far. Orders were given by touch, not voice. To call out meant losing your own direction. According to a record from a Flemish captain, fog turned winter camps into mazes. Men walked in circles searching for their own tents. Some wandered into ditches or fell asleep where they stood, their shapes discovered only at dawn. Torches were forbidden, for the light could reveal the camp's position to scouts. The result was a strange kind of blindness, one that forced every man to trust his instincts and memory. A curious detail in a knight's diary describes how men tied cords between tents to find their way through the mist. Each cord connected to another, forming invisible paths through the fog. The soldiers joked that they lived in a web, but they followed the lines faithfully. You imagine them now, moving hand over hand along rough rope, the only sound, the quiet scrape of gloves against fibre. Modern historians discuss how these conditions affected the rhythm of sleep. Fog brought dampness, and dampness meant cold that crept through even the thickest blankets. Some soldiers stayed awake through such nights, preferring exhaustion to the fear of suffocating air. Others slept sitting up, faces covered by cloaks to keep the mist from their mouths. It was said that breathing fog too deeply could drown a man from within. Inside one tent, two soldiers sit back to back. They speak softly, testing whether the fog muffles sound as much as it seems. One jokes that angels must be washing the sky. The other replies that devils are stealing it instead. They laugh quietly, the sound small but alive. Humour, even in this gloom, becomes its own kind of warmth. An Italian chronicler tells of commanders who used fog to their advantage, sending small patrols to gather wood or food while hidden from the enemy. Yet those same patrols sometimes never returned. The mist swallowed direction, and footsteps faded quickly. Some soldiers marked their path by cutting branches or leaving scraps of cloth behind, hoping to find their way back before the cold took them. A peculiar story from a Polish campaign tells of men who claimed to hear voices in the fog. They spoke of whispers that sounded like prayers or warnings. Some said it was wind passing through hollow armor. Others insisted it was the souls of the dead walking beside them. Whatever the explanation, few slept easily when the mist was thick. You walk through it now, feeling how the air changes from one step to the next. Sometimes it seems warmer, almost gentle, and then suddenly cold again, sharp as ice. The tents loom as ghostly shapes, edges blurring and fading as soon as you move past them. Somewhere close, a horse snorts, its sound swallowed almost instantly. The world feels both near and infinite. According to a monk who travelled with the armies of France, fog had a strange spiritual quality. He wrote that it was like being inside a cloud where heaven touched the ground. He meant that the boundaries between earth and sky disappeared, leaving only uncertainty. You feel that now, the sensation of being suspended in something vast and silent. Experts still debate whether soldiers feared the fog itself or what it hid. Some think the unease came from isolation, the way it erased sight and sound. Others believe it reminded them of mortality, of how easily the world could vanish. You find truth in both ideas. The fog is not an enemy but a mirror, reflecting the fragility of human presence. You pause near a pile of supplies covered in frost. Water drips from the canvas, each drop landing with a faint hiss on the cold ground. The sound repeats, slow and steady, the only measure of time in this endless grey. In one account from a German mercenary, he described sleeping in fog as like being buried alive and still breathing. Yet he also wrote that those who endured it felt a strange calm afterward. When dawn finally came and the mist lifted, the world appeared sharper, cleaner, as though reborn. You wait for that lifting now. Slowly, the fog begins to thin. The outlines of tents emerge, faint and trembling, like ghosts finding shape again. Men step outside, rubbing their eyes, blinking at the faint light returning through the mist. Someone mutters a prayer of thanks without even thinking. The camp looks smaller when the fog clears, the distance between things finally visible again. But you sense something else too, a quiet relief, the way men smile faintly at the simple gift of seeing one another again. In this place, sight itself feels like warmth. As night gives way to pale morning, the mist pulls away in slow ribbons, vanishing into the forest beyond. The soldiers stretch, shake out their cloaks, and prepare for another day. The world, once lost in grey, feels alive again. You take one last breath of the cool air, clean and thin, and it tastes like renewal. The fog is gone by noon, but the cold remains. The ground glitters with a thin layer of frost that crunches under every step. The soldiers are quieter now, their movements slower, more deliberate. There is a sense of routine in everything they do, a rhythm that has replaced fear. When life shrinks to the size of a single camp, even small acts become sacred. Chroniclers of the time often wrote about the rituals that kept soldiers sane through winter. They were not grand ceremonies but ordinary habits turned into anchors. Some men began each morning by sharpening their blades, whether they needed to or not. Others polished armor already spotless or counted arrows they had no use for. These repetitive acts created order where the world had none. A record from a French night tells of men folding and unfolding their blankets before lying down, smoothing every crease as though tidiness itself held warmth. Others trace small patterns in the frost, marks that vanished within minutes. The habits were meaningless in purpose but vital in spirit. They gave the hands something to do while the mind waited for spring. According to a letter from a Flemish archer, soldiers carved pieces of wood into small figurines. Some shaped them into saints, others into animals or faces of lovers long unseen. They carried these carvings in their pockets, rubbing them smooth during the night. One man wrote that the touch of the little statue reminded him that the world still contained shape and softness, not only sharpness and cold. Historians have noted how these tiny routines acted like prayer for men who had run out of words. Repetition replaced language. Each polished buckle, each sharpened knife, was a small declaration of control. In a season when even time seemed frozen, these gestures whispered that the self still existed. You walk through the camp and see these movements everywhere. A soldier mends a boot with thread scavenged from a cloak. Another adjusts the feathers on an arrow that may never fly. A third is bent over a scrap of parchment, writing lines that will never reach their destination. He pauses, stares at the page, then folds it carefully and places it inside his coat. The act of writing, not the message, is what matters. A peculiar note from an English chronicler mentions that men even created games from routine. They raced to pack their belongings faster than their companions, or timed who could light a candle with the fewest strikes of flint. The rewards were trivial: a bite of bread, a sip of ale, but the laughter that followed cut through the stillness. One monk who observed an army in winter called these behaviors the discipline of idleness. He meant that the men built their own order to replace the one the season had taken. Without it, minds broke faster than bodies. You see that truth now in the patient precision with which a man tightens the straps on his armor. Though there is no battle coming, the gesture has become meditation. There are stories, too, of soldiers teaching one another skills to pass the time. Tailors mended others' clothes, carpenters shaped handles for broken weapons, scribes taught letters to those who could not read. Learning became another way to stay warm. A chronicler from Milan describes such scenes as the school of the cold. You can almost picture it now, men hunched close together, their breath rising like smoke, sharing knowledge as though it were fire. A few scholars debate whether these acts were conscious resistance or simple instinct. Some claim the soldiers understood that stillness kills morale and sought distraction deliberately. Others think it was natural rhythm, the body refusing to let despair sink too deep. Either way, the repetition kept life moving forward in tiny steps, when larger ones were impossible. You kneel near a small group of soldiers playing with carved dice on a flat rock. The pieces are uneven and chipped, yet their eyes follow them with the intensity of gamblers in a palace. One man cheers softly as he wins, and the others groan in mock defeat. Then laughter ripples through them, thin but genuine. For a few seconds, the cold retreats. A curious passage from a letter written by a young squire reads, "I polish my sword, though I know I may never draw it. I do it to remember that I am still a soldier." That sentence captures the essence of the camp. These rituals are not about necessity but identity. When the world around you dissolves into snow and silence, habit becomes proof of who you are. You notice now that even the horses share in this pattern. The men brush them in rhythm, talk to them softly, feed them by hand. The creature's calm presence gives the camp its heartbeat. Their snorts and stamps fill the air like punctuation in a story told by breathing. As twilight approaches, the soldiers finish their quiet labors and prepare for rest. A few stretch their arms and look at the horizon, as though expecting something new, though nothing ever changes. The sky deepens from grey to blue, and the cold sharpens again. One man kneels and traces a small circle in the snow before lying down. Perhaps it is a charm, or simply habit. Another folds his blanket once more, smoothing the corners until they lie flat. A third hums the same tune he sang the night before. Each act is small, yet together they form the rhythm of survival. The camp stills at last. The repetition has done its work. Fear has softened into familiarity. You listen to the steady breaths, the occasional sighs, and realize that in these simple actions, the soldiers have built a kind of peace. It is not comfort, but it is continuity. Above them, the stars appear one by one, patient and pale. The world keeps turning, slow but certain, and the camp below mirrors its motion through routine. You close your eyes, hearing the faint scraping of a whetstone somewhere in the dark. The sound is almost like a lullaby, a small song of persistence whispered into the night. The next morning dawns pale and brittle. The frost glows faintly under the weak sunlight, turning every tent and weapon into a sculpture of glass. The soldiers move through the stillness like figures from a dream, their breath rising in soft plumes. It is the kind of morning that feels fragile, as if the world might shatter with one loud sound. You notice that the men are quieter than usual. The jokes and chatter that filled earlier mornings have faded. They work without speaking, their movements heavy but steady. The season has stripped them down to something simple: breath, muscle, and patience. Every gesture now belongs to the rhythm of endurance. According to letters from several medieval soldiers, there comes a point in every winter campaign when the cold no longer feels like an enemy but like a companion. They stop fighting it and simply exist beside it. One French archer wrote, "At last the frost and I have made peace. It does not bite me, and I do not curse it." You can sense that same weary acceptance here. The men do not flinch at the wind anymore. They let it pass through them. In the chronicles of the Teutonic campaigns, one observer wrote that after enough nights, soldiers learned to move half asleep, their bodies remembering what their minds forgot. They woke and packed their tents before sunrise, ate without tasting, walked without thinking. Routine replaced thought, and thought replaced fear. You see that pattern repeating itself now as men fold canvas, tie ropes, and adjust armor in silence. A curious note from an Italian scribe describes how the eyes of soldiers in winter took on a distant look, as if fixed on something far beyond the horizon. He believed it was the mark of those who had seen too much sameness, too much grey. Perhaps he was right. The men around you stare past the camp as though looking for colour in a world that has forgotten how to make any. Experts today often discuss this strange calm as a kind of endurance trance. The human body cannot sustain panic forever. Eventually, even suffering becomes familiar. The soldier's quiet is not resignation but adaptation. They have become part of the season itself, moving as slowly and inevitably as the snow that falls each night. You watch a group of men gathering what little remains of food. The bread is hard, the wine thin, but they eat with the same care as if it were a feast. One breaks a piece of bread in half and hands it to his companion without a word. The gesture carries more weight than speech. Shared hunger has replaced friendship with something quieter, but stronger. A peculiar entry from a Burgundian officer mentions that during the final weeks of a long winter, laughter sounded strange to him, like an echo of another life. Yet he also wrote that silence began to feel holy, a kind of peace found only when the world grew too cold for noise. You understand what he meant. The silence now is not emptiness but fullness, the stillness of people who have given everything they can and yet continue to move. In one corner of the camp, a young soldier is mending his boot again. The leather splits each morning, no matter how many times he stitches it. Still, he works carefully, tongue between his teeth, the thread biting into his fingers. When he finishes, he presses the boot to his chest as though testing its heartbeat. Then he smiles faintly, satisfied with the illusion of control. The oldest men sit together near a wall of packed snow, their faces expressionless. They have stopped speaking of home. Instead, they talk of small things: how frost patterns form on canvas, how the stars look sharper in cold air, how the sound of a horse snorting feels like company. The conversation flows slowly, like smoke rising from invisible embers. A historian once wrote that winter stripped soldiers of everything but rhythm. You can see that truth unfold here. Each movement lifting a pack, brushing snow from a sleeve, Stretching stiff fingers becomes ritual. In a life reduced to endurance, repetition becomes meaning. The commander passes through the camp, his cloak stiff with frost, his eyes scanning the rows of tents. He does not shout or hurry. His men already know what to do. Discipline has melted into instinct. This is not obedience anymore. It is survival performed with quiet dignity. You look beyond the camp, where the horizon blurs into white. There is no clear path forward, only the endless sameness of the land. Yet the men will march again tomorrow, because that is what they do. Somewhere inside them, hope persists, not the blazing hope of victory, but the quiet, steady hope of continuation, the kind that needs no words, only breath. One final account from a crusader's letter says, "At the end of winter, I understood that the world endures by habit, not by promise. The line settles in your mind like snow on stone. You understand him completely. Survival is not a matter of triumph, but of repetition, of standing up each day to face what is still cold and unmoving. As dusk begins to fall, the camp grows still again. The men retreat to their tents, their shapes fading into the dim light. You can hear the faint murmur of prayers, the rustle of blankets, the slow sigh of wind through the gaps. The frost gathers once more, a patient sculptor remaking the world in silver. You stand at the edge of the camp and take one long breath. The air burns your lungs but feels clean. For a moment, everything seems balanced: the cold, the silence, the steady persistence of those who refuse to yield. The night descends softly, and the soldiers sleep again, their dreams as quiet and enduring as the snow that covers them. The last night of winter comes without warning. The wind has gone still, and the sky stretches wide and pale above the frozen world. The camp rests quietly, smaller now, its tents half buried under the final crust of snow. The sounds are faint: a cough, a horse shifting its weight, the slow crack of ice as it settles. You can feel that the season is nearly over, though the air still holds its sharpness. It is often written in chronicles that the end of a winter campaign carried a strange mix of relief and sadness. Men had grown used to the cold, to the rhythm of hardship. When the thaw came, it did not feel like victory, but like waking from a dream that had lasted too long. The body remembered warmth, yet the mind had learned to find peace in stillness. According to a squire's letter from a 15th century army, the first sign of change came not from the sky but from the earth. The ground softened slightly underfoot. Snow melted into dark patches of mud, releasing the scent of soil that had been locked away for months. He called it the smell of life returning, though it mixed with rot and ash. You can almost smell it now, a faint, heavy sweetness rising beneath the frost. A curious passage from an English chronicler describes how the men, on such nights, took off their gloves for the first time and simply touched the ground. Their fingers sank into the half-thawed mud, and they smiled without speaking. To touch warmth again, even hidden in the earth, was like touching the promise of home. Modern historians often note that when winter finally released its hold, soldiers felt both renewed and uneasy. The hardships that once gave their day's structure disappeared. No more rituals of survival, no more careful scraping of frost or counting of breaths. The quiet endurance that had defined them now began to fade. The coming of spring meant movement, and movement meant danger. You walk through the camp and see this uncertainty in their faces. Some men sit awake, staring at the faint glow of the horizon, where the sky lightens to silver. Others pack slowly, unsure whether to feel joy or caution. Their bodies are ready to march, but their minds linger in the stillness that kept them alive. A monk who travelled with an army during the early 14th century wrote that winter teaches the soul to whisper. He believed that the months of cold gave men a kind of humility that warmer seasons quickly stole away. You think of that now, watching a soldier trace small shapes into the snow beside his tent. He draws a cross, then a circle, then wipes them both away with his glove. Some habits are not meant to last, but they leave their quiet imprint. The horses stamp restlessly, their breath rising in great clouds. The animals sense what is coming. The men feed them bits of dried grass and murmur softly, not with affection but with gratitude. These creatures carried them through hunger and frost. Now they will carry them again into the uncertain warmth ahead. A peculiar note from a Burgundian account tells of soldiers who could not sleep on the final night of winter. They lay awake listening to the slow dripping of melting ice, each drop marking the passing of a season. The sound was soft, almost musical, but it filled them with unease. They had grown used to the silence of snow. Now, the world had begun to speak again. You listen too, and you hear it. The faint drip of water from the edge of a tent, the rustle of thawing branches beyond the camp. The stillness of the past months begins to loosen. The night that once smothered now breathes. It feels alive again, yet fragile, as though it could vanish if you move too quickly. Some historians write that the final act of a winter encampment was always the same. Before dawn, soldiers gathered their belongings, stamped out what remained of their fire pits, and turned once to look back. The field behind them was marked by shallow hollows where men had slept, by piles of ash and broken wood, by melted patches of snow that bore the shape of human rest. Within a few days, the wind would erase it all. You stand among them now, watching as the first light stretches across the horizon. The frost glows faintly, the sky turns pale gold, and steam rises from the damp earth. The soldiers begin to move, pulling down tents, rolling blankets, tightening straps. They do not speak much, only nod to one another as they pass. Their faces are older than when the winter began, but steadier too. A final image from a monk's travel diary stays with you. When the cold was gone, the men seemed lighter, but the quiet they carried stayed behind their eyes. You see that same quiet now in these soldiers as they prepare to leave. They have learned something that cannot be taught, a knowledge etched not in words but in the body, the art of surviving what cannot be conquered. As the last tent falls, the camp becomes nothing more than a scar on the landscape. The men form their lines and begin to march, their boots sinking into softening snow. Each step sounds like farewell. The air smells of thawing soil, of smoke, of life beginning again. You follow them to the edge of the ridge and look back once more. The wind moves gently across the field, lifting the last traces of frost. The season ends not with triumph, but with endurance fulfilled. The soldiers fade into the distance, their cloaks blending with the pale morning light. What remains behind is silence and the faint warmth of memory. Now, dim the lights. Let the cold world recede. The camp sleeps in history's quiet shadow, its voices fading into time. Close your eyes and breathe slowly. The soldiers have moved on, and so can you. Let the snow settle. Let the silence rest. Sleep now, soft and deep. The story slows here, like a candle burning low. The long march of winter fades into quiet warmth. You feel the weight of the cold lifting, piece by piece, replaced by the gentler rhythm of your own breathing. The soldiers have vanished into memory, but their endurance remains, echoing softly through time. Every sigh of wind, every creak of floorboard, carries a hint of their strength. Let your body loosen. The stiffness of the day melts away, just as frost melts beneath the sun. The world outside is calm now. Imagine the last embers of their camp glowing faintly in the dark, tiny sparks against the endless snow. Those lights belong to another age, but their glow reaches you still, quiet and steady. Breathe in. Feel the air cool and smooth in your lungs. Breathe out, slow and deep, until your thoughts drift like smoke. Let the edges of the room blur. You are not cold here. You are not tired. You are resting beside an invisible fire that asks nothing of you except stillness. The soldiers are gone. Their footprints have faded. Only the hush of the night remains, soft as snowfall, endless as sleep. Let that silence settle inside you. Every sound grows slower now. Your heartbeat, your breath, the quiet murmur of the world. And as you drift toward rest, Carry with you the memory of those who learned to sleep in winter's hardest nights. They found peace where none should exist. So can you. Let the cold fade, let the light dim, and let yourself fall gently into dreams.